in the matter of the state versus...
Just shut up and say it already. We all know.
Gladly. For this crime, you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
No! No!
On August 4th, 2020, 19-year-old Ray O'Neill was found dead from 2 gunshot wounds to the chest on a secluded hiking trail in Torrey Pines State Natural Reserve, San Diego, California. His body was discovered at dawn by early morning joggers positioned in plain view just off the main trail, with a 9mm handgun left conspicuously at the scene. The killing had none of the hallmarks of a robbery. Ray's wallet containing $43 remained in his back pocket, his smartphone was still in his hand, and the expensive sneakers he proudly saved for remained untouched on his feet. What investigators would soon discover was that this was no random act of violence, but a meticulously planned execution carried out by 49-year-old Tammy Setters, the mother of Ray's girlfriend, who had lured him to the isolated location under the false pretense of reconciliation. Before we continue with this shocking true crime story, I'd love for you to hit subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support allows us to keep bringing these important stories to light, ensuring victims like Ray O'Neill are never forgotten. The sun was just beginning to cast long shadows across the coastal scrubland when Tammy Setters arrived at the predetermined meeting spot 30 minutes before Ray was due to appear. She had chosen this location carefully, far enough from the main parking area to avoid witnesses, yet accessible enough that Ray wouldn't become suspicious of her invitation to talk things out regarding his relationship with her daughter. Text messages recovered later from Ray's phone showed his optimism about the meeting, telling his girlfriend Stacy that he was excited your mom finally wants to make peace, and that this could be a new beginning for all of us. The area, normally buzzing with hikers enjoying views of the Pacific Ocean crashing against the dramatic cliffs below, was deliberately selected during a time when foot traffic would be minimal, a detail that would later speak to the premeditated nature of Tammy's actions. The medical examiner's report would later confirm that Ray was shot at approximately 8:15 p.m. the previous evening, just as the sun was setting over the Pacific, a beautiful backdrop to a heinous act. The first bullet entered his chest from a distance of approximately 3 feet, indicating that Tammy had been standing directly in front of him during what Ray likely believed was a conversation about accepting his relationship with her daughter. The second shot came as Ray was already falling, striking him at a downward angle and suggesting that Tammy stood over him to deliver the fatal blow. Ballistics would confirm that both bullets came from the same 9mm handgun found at the scene, a weapon that Tammy had purchased just 2 weeks earlier from a gun shop in neighboring El Cajon, where she had told the sales clerk she wanted something for home protection in her dangerous neighborhood, a claim that would later seem absurd given her comfortable middle-class home in a low-crime area of San Diego. The laid-back beach community of San Diego, with its perpetual sunshine and relaxed atmosphere, seemed an unlikely setting for such a calculated murder. Locals described the city as a place where people came to escape problems, not create them, with its perfect weather and easy lifestyle fostering a sense of permanent vacation rather than the dark undercurrents of hatred that drove Tammy Setters. Yet beneath San Diego's sunny disposition lurked the same prejudices found anywhere else in America, perhaps made more dangerous by their unexpectedness, in a place known for its progressive attitudes and cultural diversity. The contrast between the beautiful natural setting of Torrey Pines, with its rare Torrey pine trees and breathtaking ocean views, and the ugly hatred that led to a young man's blood staining its sandy soil, would be noted repeatedly by locals who could no longer look at their beloved hiking spot the same way. In the hours following the murder, Tammy Setters methodically executed the second phase of her plan, creating an alibi. Security footage from a grocery store 5 miles away captured her calmly purchasing milk, bread, and other essentials at 9:37 p.m., her demeanor showing no signs of someone who had just taken a human life. She then returned home to the 2-bedroom apartment she shared with her daughter, arriving before Stacy returned from her evening shift at a local restaurant. The neighbors later reported hearing nothing unusual that night, no arguments, no signs of distress, just the normal sounds of a television playing late into the evening. What those neighbors didn't know was that inside that ordinary-looking apartment, Tammy was washing away evidence of her crime, scrubbing gunshot residue from her hands, and changing out of clothes that contained microscopic blood spatter from Ray's wounds. The next morning, as Ray's body lay undiscovered on the cooling sand of Torrey Pines, Tammy Setters called in sick to her job as an administrative assistant at a local insurance office, the first sick day she had taken in over 6 months. She spent the morning meticulously cleaning her car, using industrial-strength cleaners on the interior and taking it through a car wash to ensure any potential evidence was destroyed. Neighbors would later recall to police that this behavior seemed odd given Tammy's usually lax attitude toward vehicle maintenance, with one stating her car was always a mess with fast food wrappers and stuff. But that day she was out there scrubbing it like she was getting ready to sell it. This unusual behavior would later become another piece in the puzzle that investigators would assemble to reveal the truth behind Ray O'Neill's murder. By mid-afternoon, as word began to spread throughout San Diego about a body discovered in Torrey Pines, Tammy maintained a facade of normalcy. She prepared dinner as usual for when her daughter would return home, even going so far as to set a place at the table for Ray, as she had reluctantly begun doing in recent weeks as a show of grudging acceptance. When Stacy burst through the door at 4:30 p.m., distraught after receiving a call from Ray's mother about his disappearance, Tammy performed her most convincing act yet, expressing shock and concern, suggesting that perhaps he had gotten into trouble or run into the wrong people. The theatrical display of surprise and worry would later be described by the prosecutor as worthy of an Oscar, given that Tammy knew exactly where Ray was and precisely what had happened to him. As evening fell on San Diego on August 5th, police officers arrived at the Setter's apartment to notify Stacy that her boyfriend had been found dead. Tammy stood by her daughter's side, comforting her as she collapsed in grief, playing the role of the supportive mother while secretly being the architect of her daughter's pain. Detective Andrew Walsh, the lead investigator on the case, would later recall in his testimony how something about Tammy's demeanor struck him as off. Her eyes showed no genuine emotion as she mechanically patted her daughter's back, and her questions about what happened seemed carefully constructed rather than spontaneous. It was the first moment of suspicion in what would become one of San Diego's most shocking murder cases, revealing how a mother's prejudice could lead her to destroy not only a young man's life, but ultimately her relationship with her own daughter and the future of her unborn grandchild. The truth about what happened that evening at Torrey Pines would take weeks to fully emerge, but the foundation was laid in those first critical hours. As police secured the crime scene and collected evidence, they noted the peculiar position of the gun, placed almost too perfectly beside the body, as though someone wanted it to be found rather than concealed. The lack of signs of struggle, the absence of defensive wounds on Ray's hands, and the direct nature of the gunshot wounds all pointed to someone Ray knew and trusted, someone he would stand face to face with without feeling threatened. What the killer didn't anticipate was that the strongest evidence wouldn't be physical at all, but would come from the most devastating source possible, the tearful testimony of a pregnant daughter forced to choose between protecting her mother and justice for the father of her unborn child. Raymond Ray O'Neill was more than just a victim in a senseless crime. He was a 19-year-old with a future as bright as the San Diego sun that he loved. Born and raised in the diverse North Park neighborhood of San Diego, Ray was the only child of hardworking parents who had instilled in him both ambition and compassion from an early age. His father, Marcus O'Neill, worked as a respiratory therapist at Scripps Mercy Hospital, while his mother, Denise, taught third grade at a local elementary school, both careers in service to others that would profoundly influence Ray's own aspirations. By all accounts, from teachers, friends, and family, Ray was exceptional, maintaining a perfect 4.0 GPA through high school while also serving as captain of the track team, volunteering weekly at a homeless shelter, and working part-time to save for college. Those who knew him described a young man with an infectious laugh that could lighten the heaviest moments and a dedication to helping others that set him apart from his peers. At the time of his death, Ray had just completed his freshman year at UC San Diego, where he was studying human biology on a pre-med track with dreams of becoming a pediatric surgeon. His academic advisor, Dr. Patricia Chen, would later testify that Ray was among the most promising students she had encountered in her 15 years at the university, combining natural intellectual gifts with a work ethic that put him at the top of every class. Ray wasn't just smart, he was purposeful, Dr. Chen stated in her court testimony, tears forming as she recalled their last conversation about his plans to apply for a prestigious research position that would have strengthened his eventual medical school applications. The research position that Dr. Chen had recommended him for would be left vacant that semester, as the professor in charge felt no other applicant matched Ray's potential, a small but significant example of the void his death created in the academic community that had embraced him. The roots of Ray's passion for medicine traced back to his childhood, when, at age 9, he had witnessed a doctor save his father's life during a severe asthma attack. The memory of that day, the fear of potentially losing his father, contrasted with the calm, confident intervention of the emergency room physician, had created in Ray a lifelong determination to be that same source of healing for others. Friends from his study group recalled how Ray would often stay late to help classmates struggling with difficult concepts, exhibiting the patience and teaching skills that would have made him an exceptional doctor. His roommate, Kevin Patterson, described how Ray kept a journal where he documented interesting medical cases he read about, writing notes about how he might have approached treatment, a practice Kevin called typical Ray, always preparing for a future that seemed so certain. It was during a required English composition course in his first semester at UCSD that Ray met Stacy Setters, a fellow freshman with similar academic ambitions but a very different background. Where Ray came from a stable, supportive family environment, Stacy had been raised by her single mother, Tammy, after her father abandoned them when Stacy was just 4 years old. Classmates noticed the immediate connection between Ray and Stacy, describing how they would often continue class discussions long after others had left, debating literature and philosophy with equal passion. What began as an intellectual connection quickly deepened, with Ray and Stacy becoming inseparable by the end of their first semester, their relationship built on shared ambitions, mutual respect, and the kind of first love that both believed would last a lifetime. Those who knew the couple described their relationship as mature beyond their years, with Ray fully supportive of Stacy's ambitions to become a research scientist, and Stacy equally encouraging of Ray's medical dreams. Fellow student and friend Jasmine Williams recalled how Ray would proudly talk about Stacy's intelligence, telling anyone who would listen that she's going to cure something important someday. Their relationship seemed to exemplify what young love could be at its best, respectful, supportive, and filled with shared goals for the future. What Ray and Stacy didn't fully anticipate was the virulent opposition their relationship would face from Stacy's mother, whose own complicated history with interracial relationships had warped her perspective rather than broadening it. By the spring of 2020, As the COVID-19 pandemic forced UCSD to transition to online learning, Ray and Stacy found themselves spending even more time together, often studying in Ray's family home, where his parents had welcomed Stacy as part of their family. Ray's mother, Denise, particularly took Stacy under her wing, recognizing in the young woman a need for maternal guidance that seemed lacking in her relationship with her own mother. For Ray's 20th birthday in May, a milestone he would never reach, Denise had secretly begun quilting a commemorative blanket featuring squares from his childhood sports jerseys, academic awards, and photos with Stacy. The unfinished quilt would later be displayed during the trial, a poignant reminder of celebrations that never occurred and a life cut brutally short. What neither Ray nor Stacy revealed to their parents was the news they had only recently confirmed themselves. Stacy was 2 months pregnant with their child. Text messages recovered from Ray's phone showed their private excitement and plans. They would finish their undergraduate degrees while raising their child with the support of Ray's parents, then pursue their advanced degrees in alternating years to ensure one of them was always primarily available for their child. The detailed 5-year plan Ray had outlined in his final text message to Stacy the night before his murder demonstrated his commitment to both their academic futures and their unexpected but welcomed role as parents. "Tomorrow, after I talk with your mom, we can finally tell everyone about the baby," he wrote. His optimism about the meeting with Tammy, a painful reminder of his fundamental belief in people's capacity for acceptance and change, a belief that would cost him his life. Beyond his academic achievements and relationship with Stacy, Ray was deeply involved in his community, volunteering twice weekly at a youth center in his old neighborhood where he mentored middle school students interested in science. The director of the center, Marcus Jefferson, established a scholarship in Ray's name after his death, awarded annually to a student who exemplifies Ray's combination of academic excellence and community service. Ray understood that his success meant nothing if he didn't use it to lift others up, Jefferson said during a community memorial service that drew over 500 attendees from all walks of San Diego life. The scholarship fund, initially hoped to support 1 student per year, received such an outpouring of donations after Ray's murder made headlines that it now supports 5 students annually through their undergraduate education. Ray's passion for running, he had been a standout track athlete specializing in the 800 meters, extended beyond competition to his personal life, where he used daily runs along San Diego's beaches as time for reflection and planning. His running journal, entered as evidence during the trial, contained not just training notes but philosophical musings about his future, his relationship with Stacy, and his hopes for positive change in a society still struggling with racial divisions. One entry, written just a week before his death, seemed particularly prophetic. "People fear what's different until they realize difference is just another word for growth." These words, read aloud by the prosecutor during closing arguments, encapsulated the tragic irony of his murder, killed by someone whose fear of difference had calcified into a hatred so profound it led to violence. The loss of Ray O'Neal reverberated through multiple communities in San Diego, the academic world that had invested in his potential, the medical community that would never benefit from his talents, the neighborhood that had watched him grow from a curious child to a determined young man, and most intimately, the family and girlfriend who were left to navigate a future without him. At Ray's funeral, held outdoors with social distancing due to pandemic restrictions, his father spoke through tears about the cruel irony that his son, who had planned to save countless lives as a doctor, could not have his own life protected. "My son believed in healing, in second chances, in the fundamental goodness of people," Marcus O'Neal said, his voice breaking. "Even as we mourn, we must try to honor that belief, though it has never been harder to do so." Perhaps the most profound impact of Ray's death would be on the child he never knew existed, the son that Stacy Setters would name Raymond Marcus O'Neill Setters, born 7 months after his father's murder. This child, described by the prosecutor as both the most innocent victim of this crime and the living legacy of its victim, would come to represent both the tragedy of what was lost and the hope of what could still be, a future generation with the potential to break the cycle of prejudice that had claimed his father's life. As Stacy would later explain through tears on the witness stand, it was ultimately for this child, the last living piece of Ray O'Neill, that she found the courage to testify against her own mother, ensuring that the truth about his father's life and death would be part of the official record that her son could someday understand. The investigation into Ray O'Neill's murder began at 6:24 a.m. on August 5, 2020, when San Diego Police Department dispatch received a 911 call from a visibly shaken jogger who had discovered a body just off the Guy Fleming Trail in Torrey Pines State Natural Reserve. "I think he's been shot," the caller reported, her voice trembling as she described the young man lying face up on the sandy soil, blood staining his light blue UC San Diego t-shirt. First responders arrived within minutes, but it was immediately clear they were too late. The victim had been dead for several hours, his body already showing signs of rigor mortis in the cool morning air. The responding officers quickly secured the area with yellow crime scene tape, creating a perimeter that extended 50 yards in each direction from the body, preserving what would become one of the most scrutinized crime scenes in recent San Diego history. Detective Andrew Walsh arrived at the scene at 7:15 a.m., having been assigned as lead investigator due to his extensive experience with homicide cases in San Diego County. A 17-year veteran of the SDPD, Walsh had investigated over 200 homicides in his career, but something about this scene immediately struck him as unusual. Most murders have a certain chaos to them, signs of struggle, evidence of panic or rage, Walsh would later testify. This scene was different, methodical, almost staged, particularly with the placement of the weapon. The 9mm handgun lay just beyond the reach of the victim's right hand, positioned in a way that initially suggested suicide, but, upon closer inspection, seemed deliberately placed to imply that possibility. The lack of gunpowder stippling on the victim's hands and the angle of the wounds quickly ruled out self-infliction, confirming Walsh's initial suspicion that the scene had been arranged to mislead investigators. Forensic technicians meticulously documented every aspect of the crime scene, photographing the body from multiple angles, before processing the surrounding area for evidence. 2 shell casings were recovered approximately 3 feet from where Ray's body lay, suggesting the shooter had stood directly in front of him when firing. The medical examiner, Dr. Sofia Rodriguez, performed a preliminary examination at the scene, noting the 2 entrance wounds in the victim's chest, one directly over the heart and another slightly lower. The precision of the shots indicated someone who either had significant firearms experience or was standing very close to the victim, Dr. Rodriguez noted in her report, adding that the lack of defensive wounds or signs of struggle suggested the victim likely knew his attacker and didn't perceive them as a threat until it was too late. This early observation would prove crucial as the investigation narrowed its focus in the coming days. As crime scene technicians continued processing the area, Detective Walsh turned his attention to identifying the victim, whose wallet contained a UC San Diego student ID card for Raymond O'Neill. A quick call to the university confirmed that Ray was a sophomore pre-med student in good standing, with no disciplinary issues or known conflicts. Walsh's next call was to Ray's parents, Marcus and Denise O'Neill, who reported they had been trying to reach their son since the previous evening, when he failed to return home after telling them he was meeting Stacy's mom to clear the air. This information provided Walsh with his first significant lead and a potential witness, Stacy Setters, Ray's girlfriend, who might have insights into the planned meeting and her mother's state of mind beforehand. By mid-morning, as the San Diego sun began to heat the crime scene, forensics had recovered several key pieces of evidence beyond the obvious gun and shell casings. A partial shoe print in the soft soil near where the shooter would have stood was photographed and cast, revealing a women's size 8 athletic shoe with a distinctive tread pattern. Technicians also collected several cigarette butts from a small clearing about 20 yards from the body, a potential waiting spot where the killer might have stood smoking before Ray's arrival. Most significantly, they discovered a crumpled receipt from a gas station located 2 miles from the reserve, dated August 4th at 7:43 p.m., for a purchase of bottled water and cigarettes, a brand that matched the butts found at the scene. The receipt bore no name, but would later prove critical when matched to Tammy Setters' credit card records. While the forensic team continued their meticulous work, Detective Walsh drove to the O'Neill family home in North Park to conduct his initial interview with the victim's parents. The detective found Marcus and Denise O'Neill in a state of devastated shock, having just received official confirmation that the body found in Torrey Pines was indeed their son. Through tears, they provided Walsh with critical background information about Ray's relationship with Stacy Setters and the ongoing tension with her mother. Tammy never made a secret of her disapproval, Marcus O'Neill stated, his voice hardening despite his grief. She would make these comments about Ray, never directly racist, but always implying he wasn't good enough for her daughter, that they came from different worlds. Denise added that Ray had been optimistic about the planned meeting with Tammy, telling them it was a chance to finally make peace after nearly a year of cold treatment and passive-aggressive behavior. By early afternoon, Detective Walsh arrived at San Diego State University's University Towers dormitory, where Stacy Setters had been staying with a friend since learning of Ray's death that morning. Walsh found a young woman consumed by grief, yet struggling to process the reality of her boyfriend's murder. During this initial interview, Stacy appeared genuinely devastated, sobbing uncontrollably as she spoke about her last conversation with Ray, in which he expressed optimism about meeting her mother. He was so sure he could win her over if they just talked one-on-one, Stacy explained between sobs. He said everyone deserves a second chance. However, Walsh noted in his report that Stacy's demeanor subtly shifted when he mentioned that her mother had called in sick to work that day. Her crying momentarily stopped, and she appeared to withdraw, stating only that her mother sometimes gets migraines before changing the subject. This subtle shift in Stacy's behavior, what Walsh would later describe as the foundational clue that altered the course of the investigation, prompted the detective to dig deeper into Tammy Setters' whereabouts on the night of the murder. A quick check revealed that Tammy had indeed called her employer at 7:15 a.m., leaving a voicemail claiming she was suffering from a severe migraine and would be unable to come to work. When Walsh asked Stacy when she had last seen her mother, she hesitated before answering that they had breakfast together that morning around 8:30 a.m., describing her mother as tired but normal. This timeline created a window of opportunity for Tammy to have committed the crime the previous evening and called in sick the following morning, potentially to clean up evidence or establish an alibi. While Walsh was interviewing Stacy, another detective visited the insurance office where Tammy Setters worked as an administrative assistant. Co-workers described Tammy as a competent but generally unfriendly woman who kept to herself and rarely participated in office social events. More tellingly, several colleagues mentioned overhearing phone conversations between Tammy and Stacy in which Tammy's tone became noticeably tense when discussing that boy or your friend from school, never referring to Ray by name. One co-worker, Jessica Barnes, provided a statement recalling an incident 3 months earlier when Tammy had become visibly agitated after seeing a photo of Ray and Stacy on her daughter's social media account, muttering that she could do so much better and that those relationships never work out in the long run. By late afternoon, forensics had processed the 9mm handgun found at the scene, revealing it had been purchased legally at a gun shop in El Cajon just 2 weeks earlier. The purchaser, whose information was on file due to California's mandatory 10-day waiting period for firearms, was none other than Tammy Setters. The store's surveillance footage showed Tammy confidently selecting the weapon, telling the sales clerk she wanted something for home defense. The timing of the purchase, approximately 2 weeks before the murder, suggested premeditation rather than a crime of passion, adding another layer to the emerging picture of a carefully planned killing. The gun had been wiped clean of fingerprints, but microscopic traces of blood spatter on the barrel matched Ray's DNA, confirming it was indeed the murder weapon. As evening fell on the first day of the investigation, Detective Walsh obtained a warrant to search Tammy Setter's cell phone records, which would reveal a damning sequence of text messages between her and Ray O'Neill. Beginning 3 days before the murder, the messages showed Tammy initiating contact with Ray, suggesting they meet to work through our differences and find common ground for Stacy's sake. The final message, sent at 7:22 p.m. on August 4th, directed Ray to park at the east lot and walk down the Guy Fleming Trail about a quarter mile. There's a nice overlook where we can talk privately. Cell tower pings placed both Tammy's and Ray's phones in the Torrey Pines area between 7:45 p.m. and 8:30 p.m., after which only Tammy's phone showed movement, traveling first to a car wash in Del Mar, then to a grocery store, and finally back to her apartment. The most chilling evidence recovered on that first day came from Ray's own phone, found still clutched in his hand at the crime scene. His final text message, sent to Stacy at 7:38 p.m., read, "About to meet your mom. She actually seems really open to talking things out. Maybe we can finally tell her about the baby after this. Love you both so much." This message, with its tragic optimism and the bombshell revelation of Stacy's pregnancy, would become central to both the investigation and the eventual trial. It not only established Ray's state of mind going into the meeting, trusting and hopeful, but also revealed a possible additional motive for Tammy beyond her racial prejudice, eliminating her daughter's boyfriend before the relationship could be further cemented by a child. When confronted with this text during a follow-up interview that evening, Stacy broke down completely, confirming that she was indeed 12 weeks pregnant with Ray's child, and that they had planned to announce the pregnancy to both families after Ray's meeting with her mother. This revelation marked the moment when the foundational clue, Stacy's strange reaction when her mother was mentioned, began to take on greater significance. As Stacy sobbed in the interview room, she made a statement that Walsh immediately flagged as crucial. "My mother always said history repeats itself, but I never thought she meant like this." When pressed about what this cryptic comment meant, Stacy revealed the first piece of the complex psychological puzzle behind the murder. Tammy Setters had herself been disowned by her parents decades earlier for dating a man of a different race, only to have him abandon her when Stacy was 4 years old. By the second day of the investigation, August 6th, 2020, Detective Andrew Walsh had assembled enough preliminary evidence to officially name Tammy Setters as the primary suspect in Ray O'Neill's murder. The convergence of the legally purchased murder weapon, the cell phone records placing her at the scene, and the clear motive of racial animus created a compelling case that was rapidly growing stronger with each new piece of evidence. Walsh began the day by briefing his investigative team, laying out a methodical approach to building an airtight case against Tammy while continuing to search for any evidence that might point to alternative suspects, a standard procedure even when the primary suspect seems obvious. "We build this case brick by brick," Walsh instructed his team. with the understanding that each piece must be solid enough to withstand the scrutiny of a jury. The morning's first breakthrough came when analysts processing traffic camera footage discovered Tammy Setter's gray Honda Civic passing through an intersection just 1 mile from Torrey Pines at 7:37 p.m. on the night of the murder, precisely aligning with the time frame established by cell phone records and Ray's final text message. More damning still, the same vehicle was captured by another camera heading away from the area at 8:43 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after the medical examiner had estimated Ray's time of death. The vehicle's license plate was clearly visible in both images, definitively placing Tammy's car in the vicinity during the critical window. When this evidence was combined with witness statements from a park ranger who recalled seeing a middle-aged woman with blonde hair sitting alone in a parked Honda Civic at the east lot around 7:15 p.m., the timeline of Tammy's movements on the night of the murder became increasingly clear. While the physical evidence mounted, Detective Walsh dug deeper into Tammy Setter's background, uncovering a history that painted a disturbing psychological portrait. Public records revealed that at age 20, Tammy, then Tammy Miller, had defied her conservative parents by dating and eventually marrying Jerome Setters, an African-American man she met while attending San Diego City College. According to an old classmate whom Walsh tracked down, Tammy's parents had immediately disowned her, cutting off all financial support and declaring that she was dead to them for contaminating the family bloodline. This severe rejection had left deep emotional scars on Tammy, who had clung to her relationship with Jerome even as it began to deteriorate shortly after Stacy's birth. Court records showed that Jerome Setters had abandoned the family when Stacy was 4 years old, filing for divorce and citing irreconcilable differences before moving to Atlanta and starting a new family, effectively disappearing from his daughter's life. Tammy, left to raise Stacy alone with no family support system, had struggled financially while harboring a growing bitterness that, according to former friends, increasingly manifested as racial resentment. One former colleague from a job Tammy held in the early 2000s recalled her making statements like, "They always leave when things get tough, and I should have listened to my parents." Thinly veiled references to her ex-husband that gradually expanded to include broader stereotypes about black men in general. This background information provided crucial context for understanding how Tammy, herself, once part of an interracial relationship, could develop such virulent opposition to her daughter dating a black man. As one psychologist would later testify at the trial, Ms. Setter's experience created a perfect psychological storm. The rejection by her parents, followed by abandonment by her husband, formed a narrative in her mind that interracial relationships were doomed and damaging. Rather than breaking the cycle of prejudice she had experienced, Tammy had internalized it and redirected it toward her daughter's relationship, seeing Ray not as an individual, but as a symbol of her own past pain and perceived mistakes. As investigators continued building their case, they located and interviewed several of Stacy's friends from UCSD who provided additional insights into Tammy's escalating hostility toward Ray. Madison Chen, Stacy's roommate during their freshman year, described witnessing a particularly disturbing incident during Parents' Weekend the previous October. Tammy showed up unannounced at our dorm room and found Ray there, helping Stacy with a chemistry assignment, Madison recounted. She didn't say anything directly to him, but as soon as he left, she launched into this tirade about how Stacy was repeating her mistakes and throwing away her future for some temporary excitement. When Stacy defended her relationship, Tammy had allegedly responded with the ominous statement, "You have no idea what these relationships cost in the long run, but I do, and I won't let you pay that price." Another friend, Tyler Washington, who had frequently driven Stacy home for weekend visits, recalled dropping her off several times and seeing Tammy watching from the window, her expression changing from neutral to hostile, upon noticing Ray in the car. On one occasion in March 2020, just as pandemic restrictions were being implemented, Tyler had overheard an argument between Tammy and Stacy in which Tammy explicitly stated, "I don't care how nice he is or how good his grades are. You know exactly why this won't work." When Stacy had countered that her mother was being hypocritical given her own past, Tammy had slammed her hand on the counter and shouted, "That's exactly why I know better than you do." This pattern of escalating confrontations, documented through multiple witness statements, established a clear trajectory of Tammy's opposition to the relationship, intensifying over time. By mid-afternoon on August 6th, forensic technicians had completed their initial analysis of clothing seized from Tammy Setter's apartment during a warranted search that morning. A navy blue windbreaker found stuffed at the bottom of a laundry hamper tested positive for gunshot residue, despite having been recently washed. Microscopic blood spatter, nearly invisible to the naked eye but detectable through luminal testing, was found on the right sleeve cuff, and preliminary DNA analysis indicated it matched Ray O'Neill's blood type. Additionally, soil samples taken from a pair of athletic shoes found in Tammy's closet matched the distinctive mineral composition of the Torrey Pines Trail area, and more importantly, the shoe tread pattern perfectly matched the partial footprint found at the crime scene. The search of Tammy's apartment also yielded an unexpected piece of evidence that spoke to the depth of her prejudice and premeditation. Hidden inside a hollowed-out book on her bedside table, investigators discovered a journal in which Tammy had been documenting her thoughts about Stacy's relationship with Ray. The entries, dating back to October 2019, when the relationship began, showed an evolution from initial disapproval. Stacy is dating a black boy from her English class, history repeating itself already, to increasingly disturbing fantasies about Ray's disappearance. If he just vanished, she would be hurt, but would eventually thank me. The final entry, dated July 29, 2020, less than a week before the murder, read, "Bought what I need today. Can't let this go on any longer. She'll hate me at first, but someday she'll understand I saved her from my fate." This journal provided a devastating window into Tammy's thought process as she moved from resentment to deadly resolution. Throughout this phase of the investigation, Detective Walsh made multiple attempts to interview Tammy Setters directly, but she consistently declined through her hastily hired attorney, Martin Cooper, who maintained his client had nothing to do with this tragic event and was simply a concerned mother being unfairly targeted. This strategy of avoidance, while legally her right, only deepened investigators' suspicions, particularly when contrasted with Stacy's behavior, as the young woman became increasingly withdrawn and evasive during follow-up interviews. When directly asked if she believed her mother could have been involved in Ray's death, Stacy would only say, "My mother has strong opinions, but," before trailing off and changing the subject, her body language suggesting she knew more than she was willing to share. The turning point in Stacy's reluctance came late on August 7th, when Detective Walsh made the strategic decision to share with her some of the evidence they had gathered against her mother. While this was an unusual step in an ongoing investigation, Walsh later explained that he sensed Stacy was withholding critical information out of a complex mix of loyalty, fear, and disbelief. After showing her photographs of the murder weapon registered to her mother and the traffic camera images placing Tammy's car near the scene, Walsh gently asked, "Has your mother said anything to you about that night that might help us understand what happened?" The question hung in the air for nearly a full minute before Stacy, visibly struggling with an internal conflict, finally whispered, "She thinks I don't know, but I heard her cleaning the car at 3 a.m. When I asked her about it the next day, she said she couldn't sleep and needed something mindless to do." This small crack in Stacy's protective wall around her mother marked a significant shift in the investigation. While still not directly implicating Tammy, Stacy had provided another piece of circumstantial evidence that aligned with the timeline investigators had constructed. More importantly, her willingness to share even this minor detail suggested that with continued gentle pressure and the presentation of irrefutable evidence, she might eventually reveal everything she knew, including whether her mother had ever directly mentioned or implicated herself in Ray's death. For the moment, however, Walsh recognized that pushing too hard could cause Stacy to retreat further, potentially losing a critical witness in what was rapidly becoming a high-profile murder case. By the end of the fourth day of the investigation, the San Diego Police Department had accumulated enough evidence to justify a formal arrest warrant for Tammy Setters on charges of first-degree murder. The combined weight of the physical evidence, the murder weapon registered in her name, her cell phone placing her at the scene, the gunshot residue and blood evidence on her clothing, and the damning journal entries created a compelling case even without a confession or direct eyewitness. However, District Attorney Maria Vasquez, in consultation with lead prosecutor Emily Martinez, made the strategic decision to delay the arrest by 48 hours to allow investigators to continue strengthening the case, particularly by pursuing additional forensic analysis of the collected evidence and making one final attempt to secure Stacy's full cooperation as a witness. This decision to build an airtight case before making an arrest proved fortuitous when, on the morning of August 9th, crime lab technicians made a breakthrough discovery. The gun used to kill Ray had been wiped clean of fingerprints, but the magazine inside the weapon had not been as thoroughly cleaned. A partial thumbprint was recovered from an inside surface of the magazine, a spot easily overlooked during a hasty cleanup, and was conclusively matched to Tammy Setters through the DMV database. This physical evidence directly connecting Tammy to the murder weapon at the time of its use, rather than just its purchase, eliminated one of the few remaining defense arguments that someone else might have stolen or used the gun without her knowledge. With this final piece in place, the decision was made to proceed with the arrest the following morning. On August 10, 2020, 6 days after Ray O'Neill's murder, the San Diego Police Department's case against Tammy Setters had evolved from circumstantial evidence to an interlocking network of physical proof, digital records, and witness statements, all pointing to a premeditated killing motivated by deep-seated racial prejudice. Detective Andrew Walsh began the day by holding a final strategy meeting with the investigative team and representatives from the district attorney's office, including lead prosecutor Emily Martinez. The goal was to ensure that every aspect of the case had been thoroughly explored before Tammy's arrest, particularly given the sensitive nature of the case involving a mother killing her daughter's boyfriend due to his race, a crime that would inevitably draw significant public attention and scrutiny. "We need this case to be bulletproof," Martinez emphasized, "not just for a conviction, but for the healing of a community shaken by such naked hatred." The forensic evidence, already substantial, continued to grow stronger as final reports came in from the crime lab. Analysis of the gunshot residue found on Tammy's windbreaker revealed a pattern consistent with someone firing a weapon while wearing the jacket, rather than residue that might have transferred from merely handling a gun. This distinction was critical as it directly placed the jacket, and by extension Tammy, at the scene during the actual shooting. Additionally, microscopic traces of Ray's blood found on the jacket's sleeve had been confirmed through DNA analysis to be a definitive match, with the spatter pattern indicating the wearer had been standing approximately 3 feet from the victim when the fatal shots were fired, exactly matching the distance suggested by the positioning of the shell casings at the crime scene. Further strengthening the physical evidence was the complete analysis of the soil samples taken from Tammy's athletic shoes. Not only did the mineral composition matched the Torrey Pines area in general, but botanists identified microscopic fragments of a rare native plant, Torrey pine needle segments and sap, that grew only in that specific reserve. The shoes also contained traces of a particular combination of sand and clay unique to the Guy Fleming Trail area where Ray's body was found. This precise environmental matching, combined with the shoe tread pattern perfectly aligning with footprints at the scene, created what the forensic technician described as a geographical fingerprint, placing Tammy at the exact location of the murder. While the physical evidence alone was compelling, detectives had also assembled an extensive digital trail documenting Tammy's actions before and after the murder. Her internet search history, obtained through a warrant served to her service provider, revealed searches for unregistered guns San Diego. How long does gunshot residue last? And, most damning, can police track deleted text, messages in the weeks leading up to the crime? On the day before the murder, she had searched for Torrey Pine secluded areas and how to remove blood from clothing, searches that demonstrated both premeditation and consciousness of guilt. Her cell phone's GPS data also perfectly aligned with the investigative timeline, showing her movements from her apartment to Torrey Pines, then to a car wash, a grocery store, and back home, all within the time window established by other evidence. Perhaps the most disturbing digital evidence came from a recovered series of text messages between Tammy and Ray that had been deleted from her phone but were retrieved from the service provider's records. Beginning 3 days before the murder, Tammy had initiated a conversation expressing a desire to make peace and accept what can't be changed. Her messages were carefully crafted to appear conciliatory, with phrases like, "I may never fully understand your relationship, but Stacy's happiness matters to me, and maybe I've been too quick to judge based on my own experiences." The calculated nature of these messages, written by a woman who had privately documented her hatred in a journal, revealed the depth of deception involved in luring Ray to a secluded location where he would feel safe enough to lower his guard. The financial evidence also told a compelling story of premeditation. Bank records showed that on July 28th, Tammy had withdrawn $850 in cash, an unusual transaction for someone who typically used her debit card for most purchases. This cash was used 2 days later to purchase the 9mm handgun at the L.K. John gun shop, with Tammy paying extra for expedited processing of the mandatory waiting period paperwork. The gun shop owner recalled that Tammy had seemed unusually interested in how quickly she could take possession of the weapon, claiming she had received threats from an ex-boyfriend. This fabricated story about needing protection, combined with the cash purchase, which was less traceable than her usual electronic payments, demonstrated Tammy's efforts to obscure her true intentions while ensuring she had the means to carry out the murder. Beyond the growing mountain of physical and digital evidence, investigators had also been building a comprehensive psychological profile of Tammy Setters through interviews with those who knew her. Co-workers described a woman who kept largely to herself, but occasionally made comments revealing deep-seated racial resentment. One colleague recalled Tammy reacting to news of a local interracial couple's engagement by muttering, "Hope she likes raising those kids alone." Another remembered Tammy arguing against her daughter attending UC San Diego because it was too diverse, and she worried Stacy would lose her identity there. These seemingly casual comments, when viewed in the context of the murder investigation, revealed a consistent pattern of racial animus that had apparently intensified as her daughter's relationship with Ray deepened. The most significant development in understanding Tammy's motive came from a former neighbor, Eleanor Jenkins, who had lived in the apartment next to the Setters for several years before moving to Arizona in 2018. Jenkins described witnessing numerous arguments between Tammy and a teenage Stacy about race and identity. Tammy would tell these awful stories about how her parents had disowned her for marrying Stacy's father, how they called her disgusting names and cut her out of the will, Jenkins recalled. But instead of rejecting that kind of hatred, she seemed to absorb it, like she eventually decided her parents had been right all along. Jenkins further recalled Tammy making statements about how mixing races only leads to heartbreak, and telling Stacy that your father left because that's what they do, it's in their nature. Generalizations that revealed how her personal trauma had morphed into broader prejudice. This cycle of prejudice, being a victim of it, then perpetuating it, became a central element in the prosecution's understanding of the case. Emily Martinez, reviewing the evidence with her team, noted that Tammy's history created a twisted logic that made murder seem justified in her mind. Having been disowned by her parents for an interracial relationship that ultimately failed, Tammy appeared to have concluded that the only way to protect her daughter from a similar fate was to eliminate Ray entirely. This warped reasoning was documented in her journal entries, which showed an escalating conviction that she was acting out of maternal concern rather than hatred, a delusion that allowed her to plan and execute a cold-blooded murder while viewing herself as a protective mother. The investigation took an unexpected turn when detectives interviewed several members of Ray's study group who revealed that Ray had been aware of Tammy's deep-seated prejudice and had been systematically trying to address it. Ray believed everyone deserved a chance to grow, explained his classmate Jasmine Williams. He had this whole plan to win Tammy over by showing her he was serious about education, about Stacy's future, about being responsible. According to Jasmine, Ray had deliberately taken extra shifts at his campus job to save money, maintained his perfect GPA, and even researched Tammy's cultural background to find common ground for conversations, all part of a strategy to overcome her resistance through persistent positivity. This revelation made the murder even more tragic, highlighting how Ray's optimistic belief in reconciliation had made him vulnerable to Tammy's deadly deception. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Detective Walsh made one final attempt to interview Stacy Setters, hoping she might finally reveal whether her mother had said anything directly incriminating after the murder. This interview, conducted in the presence of a victim advocate to provide emotional support, began with Stacy still maintaining a protective stance toward her mother. However, as Walsh methodically presented the evidence they had gathered, the gun purchase, the text messages luring Ray to Torrey Pines, the journal entries expressing clear intent, Stacy's resolve visibly weakened. When shown the final text message Ray had sent her about announcing their pregnancy, Stacy placed both hands protectively over her stomach, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "He was so happy about the baby. He said it was like our love creating something perfect." This moment of emotional vulnerability created an opening, and Walsh gently asked, "Has your mother said anything about the baby, Stacy?" The question hung in the air for several long moments before Stacy, her voice barely audible, responded, "The morning after it happened, when the police called about Ray, my mother held me while I cried. But when I told her I was pregnant, something changed in her eyes." Stacy then described how Tammy had gripped her shoulders and said, "This doesn't have to define your life. No one needs to know who the father was. We can say it was someone else, someone better for you and the baby." This statement, while not a direct confession to the murder, revealed Tammy's desire to erase Ray from their lives completely, even as the father of her grandchild, and provided additional evidence of her motive. By the afternoon of August 10th, with the case firmly established through physical evidence, digital records, witness statements, and psychological profiling, Detective Walsh obtained a formal arrest warrant for Tammy Setters on charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances of lying in wait, a charge that carried the possibility of life imprisonment without parole. The decision was made to execute the warrant the following morning at Tammy's workplace rather than her home, both to minimize the potential for flight and to avoid creating additional trauma for Stacy, who was still processing the dual shock of her boyfriend's murder and her mother's likely responsibility for it. As Walsh filed the final paperwork, he reflected on the case that had come together with unusual speed and clarity, a testament not to investigative brilliance, he would later say, but to the suspect's fundamental misunderstanding of modern forensic capabilities and her own daughter's moral compass. The extensive case built against Tammy Setters represented a textbook example of modern homicide investigation, combining traditional detective work with advanced forensic techniques and digital analysis. Yet beyond the methodical accumulation of evidence lay a disturbing psychological story about the persistence of racial prejudice across generations, how it can be experienced, internalized, and then weaponized in a tragic cycle. As prosecutor Emily Martinez prepared for Tammy's arraignment, she understood that this case would not only seek justice for Ray O'Neal, but would also force a community to confront uncomfortable truths about how prejudice can hide behind the veneer of parental concern and how even those who have suffered from discrimination can sometimes become its most vehement perpetrators. On the morning of August 11, 2020, exactly 1 week after Ray O'Neal's body was discovered at Torrey Pines, Detective Andrew Walsh led a team of 4 officers to the Oceanside Insurance Group offices in downtown San Diego, where Tammy Setters worked as an administrative assistant. The officers arrived at 9:15 a.m., timing their approach to coincide with the morning break when they could minimize disruption to the workplace while ensuring their suspect would be present. Walsh had specifically instructed his team to maintain a low profile, no sirens, no unnecessary show of force. Understanding that the evidence they had gathered was more than sufficient to secure a conviction without the need for a dramatic public arrest. His primary concern now was executing the arrest with professionalism while preserving Tammy's dignity to whatever extent possible, knowing that her daughter would eventually have to process this moment as part of her own healing journey. The insurance office occupied the 4th floor of a modern glass building overlooking San Diego Harbor, its bright open-plan layout designed to project transparency and trustworthiness to clients. When the officers stepped off the elevator, they were immediately greeted by a receptionist whose welcoming smile faded as she noted their badges and serious expressions. Walsh quietly identified himself and asked to speak with Tammy Setters regarding a police matter, prompting the receptionist to make a discreet call rather than using the office-wide intercom. Moments later, Tammy emerged from a back office, a stack of files clutched to her chest like a shield, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to wary recognition as she spotted the detective she had previously declined to speak with through her attorney. "Ms. Setters, I have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the murder of Raymond O'Neal," Walsh stated in a calm, measured tone, deliberately keeping his voice low to minimize the spectacle for her co-workers. "I need you to come with us now." For a moment, Tammy remained perfectly still, her face betraying no emotion beyond a slight tightening around her eyes, a composure that Walsh would later describe as unnervingly practiced. Then, without protest, she placed the files on a nearby desk, smoothed her skirt with a deliberate gesture, and extended her wrists toward the officers. This composed surrender, while making the arrest process easier, struck Walsh as eerily reminiscent of the methodical nature of the crime itself, a woman who had mentally rehearsed even this moment of accountability. As Officer Melissa Rodriguez gently placed handcuffs on Tammy's wrists, explaining her rights in a professional tone, the office had fallen into a stunned silence. Co-workers stood frozen at their desks, many with expressions of disbelief as they watched the quiet administrative assistant being led away in handcuffs. One older woman began to protest, stepping forward to declare There must be some mistake, only to be silenced by Tammy herself, who stated flatly, "It's fine, Barbara. Please call Martin Cooper and tell him they've taken me in." The calm, almost rehearsed nature of this instruction, referencing her attorney by name and providing clear direction, further reinforced Walsh's impression of someone who had anticipated this moment and prepared for it, mentally, if not legally. The drive to police headquarters took place in near-complete silence, with Tammy staring out the window at the sun-drenched San Diego streets as though memorizing them for a long absence. When they arrived at the station, she was processed efficiently, photographed, fingerprinted, and relieved of her personal effects, which included a small silver locket containing a photo of Stacy as a child on one side and, strangely, an empty frame on the other. This empty space in the locket would later become a point of interest for prosecutors, who would suggest it symbolized Tammy's rejection of her own past, specifically, the space once occupied by a photo of Stacy's father, deliberately removed to erase that chapter of her life just as she had attempted to erase Ray from her daughter's future. By 11:30 a.m., Tammy had been settled in Interview Room B, a sparse space with little more than a table, 3 chairs, and a one-way observation mirror that reflected her composed but drawn face back at her. Detective Walsh and his partner, Detective Sophia Ramirez, entered the room carrying slim folders and bottles of water, presenting an intentionally casual demeanor designed to encourage conversation. Walsh had specifically chosen Ramirez to join the interrogation based on her extensive experience with suspects in domestic homicides and her reputation for establishing rapport even with the most reluctant interviewees. Their strategy was clear: give Tammy space to tell her story while systematically presenting evidence that would make continued denial untenable. "Ms. Setters, I want to thank you for agreeing to speak with us," Walsh began, though they both knew she had little choice in the matter. "Before we start, I need to remind you that you have the right to have your attorney present during questioning." Tammy nodded, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her, and responded with unexpected directness. "I'm aware of my rights, Detective. Martin is probably on his way, but we can begin without him." This willingness to proceed without counsel initially seemed promising to the detectives, though they remained cautious, understanding that Tammy's composure and apparent cooperation might be a strategic attempt to appear innocent rather than a genuine desire to assist the investigation. The interrogation began with basic background questions, Tammy's employment history, her relationship with her daughter, her daily routines, designed to establish a baseline of communication before approaching more sensitive topics. Throughout these preliminary questions, Tammy maintained a calm, almost detached demeanor, answering efficiently but without elaboration. When Walsh gradually shifted the conversation toward Ray O'Neill, however, a subtle change became apparent. Her posture stiffened slightly, and her responses became more measured, as though each word was being carefully evaluated before spoken. "When did you first meet Ray?" Walsh asked, maintaining the conversational tone despite the shift in subject. "At Parents' Weekend last October," Tammy replied, her voice noticeably cooler. "Stacy introduced us after her English composition class." As the questioning progressed to the night of August 4th, Tammy presented a carefully constructed alibi that contradicted the evidence investigators had gathered. She claimed to have been home all evening with a migraine, venturing out only briefly to pick up groceries around 9:30 p.m., an account that aligned with the security footage from the grocery store but conveniently omitted her earlier presence at Torrey Pines. When Detective Ramirez gently pointed out this inconsistency with cell phone records, placing her near the reserve earlier that evening, Tammy's first crack in composure appeared, a barely perceptible tightening of her jaw and a quick dart of her eyes toward the door, as though calculating how long before her attorney would arrive to end the questioning. "We have the text messages, Tammy," Walsh said quietly. sliding a printed transcript across the table, showing the exchanges between her and Ray, in which she had suggested meeting at Torrey Pines. Your phone was there. Your car was captured on traffic cameras heading to and from the area. The gun registered in your name was found beside his body. With each piece of evidence presented, Tammy's carefully maintained facade began to show hairline fractures, a slight tremor in her hand as she pushed the transcript away, a momentary loss of eye contact, a barely audible sigh that suggested recognition of the case being built against her. Still, she maintained her denials, now claiming she had indeed arranged to meet Ray, but had changed her mind at the last minute due to her migraine, never actually seeing him that evening. This revised narrative prompted Walsh to introduce the most damning physical evidence, photographs of the gunshot residue found on her jacket, and the microscopic blood spatter matched to Ray. "We found these on the windbreaker hidden at the bottom of your laundry hamper," Walsh explained, his tone remaining professional rather than accusatory. "The residue pattern is consistent with someone firing a weapon while wearing the jacket, and the blood matches Ray's DNA." For the first time since her arrest, Tammy's composure truly faltered. Her face paled visibly, and she requested a brief break, claiming she needed to use the restroom. This request, coming immediately after the presentation of irrefutable forensic evidence, was noted by both detectives as a significant reaction from a woman who had maintained remarkable control throughout the process. Upon her return to the interview room, Tammy was noticeably more subdued, her earlier confidence diminished by the weight of evidence she now understood the police had accumulated. It was at this precise moment, sensing the shift in her demeanor, that Detective Walsh decided to introduce the final emotional catalyst, the revelation about her daughter's pregnancy. "Tammy, we know that Stacy is pregnant with Ray's child," he stated quietly, placing a copy of Ray's final text message to Stacy on the table. He was excited about becoming a father. They were planning to tell both families after your meeting. The effect of this information was profound and immediate. Tammy's hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, suddenly clenched into fists, her knuckles whitening with tension as her breathing became noticeably irregular. "That's impossible," Tammy whispered, her voice barely audible in the small room. "She would have told me." But the conviction in her denial was undermined by the visible shock on her face, a revelation that suggested not just surprise, but a devastating realization that the very outcome she had sought to prevent through murder had already come to pass. For several long moments, Tammy sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the text message with its painfully optimistic reference to the baby. When she finally spoke again, her words revealed the first glimpse into her true motive. She was supposed to have a different life than mine, better choices, not trapped by a child with someone who would leave her alone to struggle. This statement, with its clear connection between her own past experience and her fears for her daughter, created an opening that Detective Ramirez skillfully expanded. "You were trying to protect Stacy," Ramirez suggested, her tone sympathetic rather than accusatory. "You didn't want her to go through what you did when Stacy's father left." This approach, offering understanding for the emotional motivation while not excusing the action, momentarily broke through Tammy's defenses. "You don't understand what it's like," she responded, her voice rising with sudden emotion. "My parents were right all along. The pain, the rejection, the struggle of raising a child alone while everyone judges you. I couldn't watch Stacy throw away her future the same way." While this emotional outburst stopped short of a direct confession, it provided critical insight into Tammy's psychological state and motive, confirming that her actions stemmed from a distorted protective impulse rooted in her own traumatic experiences. Walsh recognized the opportunity to press further, gently but persistently, pointing out the contradiction in her claim to be protecting her daughter. "But by taking Ray's life, you've guaranteed that Stacy will raise this child alone, exactly the fate you claim to be protecting her from. This observation struck a visible chord, momentarily disrupting Tammy's narrative of justified protection and forcing her to confront the illogical nature of her actions when viewed through the lens of her stated concern for Stacy's future. Before Tammy could formulate a response to this challenging perspective, the interview room door opened to admit Martin Cooper, her attorney, who immediately instructed her to cease answering questions. "This interview is over," Cooper declared firmly, placing his briefcase on the table with a decisive thud. "My client has nothing further to say at this time." Though the formal interrogation had indeed concluded without a direct confession, the detectives had achieved their primary objectives, establishing Tammy's presence at the scene, documenting her reaction to key evidence, and most crucially, capturing her statements about motive that revealed the twisted logic behind her actions. These recorded statements, combined with the mountain of physical and circumstantial evidence, would form the foundation of what prosecutor Emily Martinez was already describing as an airtight case. Following the interrogation, Tammy was processed for transfer to the Las Colinas Detention Facility, the women's jail, in Santee, California, where she would be held without bail pending arraignment. As officers prepared her for transport, she made a single request: to speak with her daughter. This request was denied by Walsh, who explained that contact with Stacy would be at the discretion of the court, given Stacy's status as both a family member of the accused and a potential witness for the prosecution. The significance of this request was not lost on the detective. It represented Tammy's first expression of concern for someone other than herself since her arrest, though whether this stemmed from maternal worry or a desire to influence Stacy's potential testimony remained unclear. The arrest and interrogation of Tammy Setters marked the transition from investigation to prosecution in the Ray O'Neill murder case. While she had maintained technical denial throughout questioning, her emotional responses and revelations about motive had provided valuable insights that would inform the prosecution's strategy. Most significantly, her reaction to learning about Stacy's pregnancy, genuine shock, followed by distress that her actions had been for naught, confirmed the investigators' theory that she had acted to sever the relationship permanently, unaware that it had already produced the very consequence she feared most: a biracial grandchild who would be living testimony to the relationship she had violently rejected. This tragic irony, killing the father of her future grandchild in a misguided attempt to protect her daughter from a fate that had already manifested, would become central to the prosecution's portrayal of a woman whose prejudice had not only taken an innocent life, but had ensured her daughter would face the very struggle she claimed to be preventing. On February 1, 2021, nearly 6 months after Ray O'Neill's murder, the San Diego County Superior Courthouse stood as an imposing backdrop to what local media had dubbed the Prejudice Murder Trial, a case that had captured national attention for its disturbing intersection of racial animus, family betrayal, and generational trauma. The courthouse, a blend of Spanish colonial revival architecture and modern security features, was surrounded by an unusual mix of demonstrators, anti-racism activists holding signs with Ray's smiling face, family advocates arguing for understanding of Tammy's distorted maternal instincts, and media personalities from across the political spectrum, each framing the case to align with their particular worldview. Inside, beyond the metal detectors and security checkpoints, Courtroom 3B had been prepared for what Judge Harold Phillips had already warned would be a trial that will test our community's commitment to justice over emotion. The courtroom itself reflected the gravity of the proceedings: high ceilings with wood paneling designed to amplify speakers' voices, American and California flags flanking the judge's bench, and seating areas clearly demarcated to separate the jury, public observers, media representatives, and families of both the victim and the accused. By 8:30 a.m., every seat was filled, with priority given to the O'Neill family, who sat together in the front row directly behind the prosecution table, a united front of grief and determination in their matching blue ribbons, Ray's favorite color. Across the aisle, the defense section remained conspicuously sparse, with only a few colleagues from Tammy's workplace present to show support, highlighting the isolation that her actions had created, most notably the absence of her daughter Stacy, who had chosen to sit with the O'Neill family, her pregnancy now visibly advanced at 7 months. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff called for all to rise as Judge Harold Phillips entered the courtroom, his reputation for no-nonsense efficiency and strict impartiality preceding him. At 68 years old, with over 3 decades on the bench, Phillips was known for managing high-profile cases with a firm hand that prevented grandstanding while ensuring both sides received fair treatment. After seating the court and addressing preliminary matters, he turned to the jury selection process with clear instructions. The jurors in this case must set aside any preconceptions about race, family dynamics, or maternal responsibility. Your job is to evaluate evidence, not emotions. This directive set the tone for a voir dire process that would take 3 full days, as attorneys from both sides carefully questioned potential jurors about their attitudes toward interracial relationships, their relationships with their own mothers, and their ability to separate sympathy from legal judgment. By February 4th, a jury had been seated, 8 women and 4 men representing San Diego's diverse population, with ages ranging from 27 to 74 and backgrounds spanning from education to healthcare to construction. With alternates selected and jurors sworn in, Judge Phillips called for opening statements to begin on the morning of February 5th. The courthouse atmosphere that day was electric with anticipation as prosecutor Emily Martinez rose from her seat, smoothing her dark blue suit jacket with a deliberate gesture before approaching the jury. A veteran prosecutor with 15 years of experience handling homicide cases, Martinez was known for her methodical approach and ability to distill complex emotional situations into clear narratives of accountability, skills perfectly suited to a case as laden with psychological nuance as this one. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Martinez began, her voice steady and resolute, "this case is about a prejudice so deep and a control so desperate that a mother chose to murder rather than allow her daughter the freedom to love across racial lines." She paused, allowing the gravity of this framing to settle over the courtroom before continuing. "The evidence will show that on August 4th, 2020, Tammy Setters meticulously planned and executed the killing of 19-year-old Ray O'Neill, not because he posed any threat to her daughter, not because he was anything other than an exemplary young man with a bright future, but because his skin color triggered in her a cycle of prejudice that began with her own parents decades earlier. This reference to the generational aspect of the prejudice immediately captured the jury's attention, several members leaning forward slightly as Martinez outlined the psychological backdrop to the crime. Over the next 40 minutes, Martinez methodically laid out the prosecution's case, using a large digital screen to display a timeline of events beginning with Tammy's first documented expressions of disapproval of Ray and culminating in the calculated murder at Torrey Pines. She introduced key pieces of evidence: the gun purchase record, the text messages luring Ray to the meeting, the jacket with gunshot residue, the journal entries revealing premeditation, each element building upon the last to create a comprehensive picture of a woman whose racial prejudice had festered into deadly action. Throughout this presentation, Martinez maintained eye contact with the jury, her tone factual rather than inflammatory, allowing the evidence itself to generate the appropriate outrage rather than relying on emotional appeals. The most powerful moment in Martinez's opening came when she introduced the foundational element that would define the prosecution's case: the daughter's knowledge of her mother's guilt. The evidence will show that Tammy Setters confessed to her daughter, Martinez stated, her voice softening for the first time. In a moment of emotional breakdown after learning of Stacy's pregnancy, Tammy begged her daughter to stay silent for the baby's sake, invoking the very grandchild whose father she had just murdered. This revelation sent visible ripples through the courtroom, with several jurors writing notes rapidly and observers exchanging glances of shock. Stacy Setters will tell you about that confession, Martinez continued, and about the impossible choice she faced, loyalty to her mother or justice for the father of her child. Her testimony will reveal the final, cruel irony of this case, that in attempting to prevent her daughter from repeating her own history of single motherhood, Tammy Setters guaranteed exactly that outcome. Martinez concluded by directing the jury's attention to the fundamental motive behind the crime, the cycle of racial prejudice that had shaped Tammy's worldview. You will hear how Tammy Setters was herself disowned by her parents for an interracial relationship decades ago, a traumatic rejection that should have taught her the pain of racial prejudice. Instead, when her own daughter formed a similar relationship, Tammy didn't break the cycle. She completed it, transforming from victim to perpetrator. This framing of the case as not merely a murder, but a tragic perpetuation of generational prejudice established the psychological complexity that would define the trial, challenging jurors to consider not just what had happened, but the deeper societal wounds that the case exposed. When Martinez returned to her seat, defense attorney Martin Cooper rose to present his opening statement. A seasoned criminal defender with a reputation for finding sympathetic angles in seemingly indefensible cases, Cooper approached the jury with a grave expression that acknowledged the uphill battle he faced. "The prosecution has presented you with a narrative that seems clear-cut," he began, his tone measured and thoughtful. "But human behavior, particularly a mother's behavior toward her child, is rarely so simple." Rather than directly challenging the physical evidence, which he tacitly acknowledged was substantial, Cooper focused on reframing Tammy's motive in terms that might generate understanding, if not exoneration. "Tammy Setters is not a monster driven by hatred," Cooper argued, pacing slowly before the jury box. "She is a wounded woman whose life experiences taught her painful lessons about interracial relationships, not because of race itself, but because of how society treated her family." He described how Tammy had been abandoned by both her parents and her husband, left to raise Stacy alone with no support system and constant financial struggle. The evidence will show that Tammy's opposition to Ray O'Neill wasn't based on his character or even primarily his race, but on her desperate fear that her daughter would suffer the same isolation and hardship she had experienced. This attempt to recast racial prejudice as protective concern immediately drew skeptical expressions from several jurors, suggesting they recognized the logical inconsistency in claiming that killing a supportive partner would somehow prevent hardship. Cooper's most effective argument came when addressing the premeditation aspect of the charge, suggesting that while Tammy had arranged the meeting with Ray, the decision to bring the gun was motivated by fear rather than murderous intent. Ms. Setters purchased that firearm for protection in an increasingly uncertain world, he claimed, referencing the early pandemic period during which the crime occurred. She brought it to a remote meeting with a young man she barely knew, out of caution, not calculation. This argument, though contradicted by Tammy's journal entries and the precise execution of the crime, represented Cooper's attempt to introduce doubt regarding the first-degree murder charge, potentially opening the door to a lesser conviction of second-degree murder or manslaughter, a strategy that legal observers in the courtroom immediately recognized as aiming for sentence mitigation rather than acquittal. The defense's opening concluded with a direct appeal to the jury to consider the complex psychological factors at play rather than reducing the case to simple racism. Before you judge Tammy Setters, Cooper urged, ask yourselves what experiences shaped her fears, what traumas informed her actions, and whether a woman who has already lost everything, her parents, her husband, and now her relationship with her only child, deserves to lose her freedom for the rest of her life as well. This appeal to sympathy, while skillfully delivered, seemed to fall flat with many jurors, whose expressions remained stoic as Cooper returned to the defense table, where Tammy sat in a conservative navy dress, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face deliberately expressionless. Following opening statements, Judge Phillips called the first prosecution witness, Detective Andrew Walsh, who would establish the foundational elements of the investigation. Walsh's testimony walked the jury methodically through the discovery of Ray's body, the collection of evidence at the scene, and the investigative process that had led to Tammy's arrest. Using crime scene photographs, ballistics reports, and cell phone records, Walsh constructed a precise timeline of the murder that left little room for alternative interpretations. His testimony was particularly effective in establishing the premeditated nature of the crime, highlighting Tammy's gun purchase, her careful selection of the meeting location, and her subsequent attempts to clean evidence from her clothing and vehicle. During cross-examination, Cooper focused primarily on establishing that no eyewitnesses had actually seen Tammy shoot Ray, attempting to create space for reasonable doubt despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence. Walsh countered this approach effectively by explaining the constellation of evidence concept, how multiple pieces of circumstantial evidence, when aligned perfectly, can be more conclusive than a single direct observation. In my 17 years investigating homicides, Walsh testified, I've rarely seen a case with such clear physical, digital, and psychological evidence all pointing to the same conclusion. This statement, delivered with the calm confidence of an experienced investigator rather than prosecutorial zeal, appeared to resonate with the jury, many of whom nodded subtly as Walsh detailed the methodical process that had led to Tammy's identification as the killer. The second day of testimony brought forensic experts to the stand, including Dr. Sofia Rodriguez, the medical examiner who had performed Ray's autopsy. Using anatomical diagrams and carefully selected autopsy photographs that showed the wounds without unnecessarily graphic detail, Dr. Rodriguez explained how the 2 gunshot wounds indicated a shooter who was both deliberate and emotionally detached. The first shot was perfectly placed to strike the heart, she testified, pointing to the diagram. The second shot, delivered as the victim was falling, shows no hesitation or wavering. Both are hallmarks of a determined rather than panicked shooter. This technical testimony, while necessarily clinical, helped humanize Ray by emphasizing the painful contrast between his promising future and the calculated manner of his death. Forensic technician Javier Morales followed, providing detailed analysis of the gunshot residue found on Tammy's windbreaker and the blood spatter pattern that matched Ray's DNA. Using visual aids and simplified explanations of complex forensic concepts, Morales helped the jury understand the irrefutable physical connection between Tammy and the shooting. His most powerful testimony came when explaining how the distinctive Torrey pine botanical material found on Tammy's shoes could only have come from the specific location where Ray was killed, evidence that directly contradicted her claim of never having gone to the meeting. These microscopic plant fragments are like a botanical fingerprint, Morales explained, displaying magnified images on the courtroom screen. They placed the wearer of these shoes at the exact location of the murder, not just near it. As the first week of the trial progressed, the prosecution built a methodical case that addressed not just the physical evidence of the crime, but its psychological underpinnings. Former neighbors and co-workers testified about Tammy's increasing expressions of racial resentment after Stacy began dating Ray, with statements that revealed her opposition was specifically racial rather than based on any aspect of Ray's character or behavior. Ray's academic advisor and classmates provided testimony about his exemplary character and achievements, establishing that Tammy's prejudice was entirely unfounded in any realistic concern about his influence on her daughter. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of Eleanor Jenkins, the former neighbor who recounted conversations with Tammy about her own parents' racial prejudice, establishing the cycle of discrimination that Tammy had internalized rather than rejected. By the end of the first week of testimony, the prosecution had established a compelling narrative of a premeditated murder motivated by racial prejudice, supported by substantial physical evidence and witness testimony. The defense had made minimal headway in challenging the facts of the case, focusing instead on humanizing Tammy through questions about her struggles as a single mother and the trauma of her own rejection by her parents. As the courthouse emptied on Friday afternoon, legal observers noted that the coming week would bring the most anticipated and potentially most devastating testimony yet. Stacey Setters, taking the stand against her own mother, prepared to reveal the confession that had finally broken her silence and led her to choose justice for Ray over loyalty to the woman who had raised her. On Monday morning, February 8, 2021, the San Diego County Superior Courthouse corridors buzzed with unprecedented tension as spectators, media representatives, and legal observers gathered hours before proceedings were scheduled to begin. The reason for this extraordinary interest was clear to everyone present. Stacey Setters, now 8 months pregnant with Ray O'Neill's child, would be taking the stand to testify against her mother. Court officers had implemented additional security measures, concerned about the emotional volatility of the situation and the intense public interest it had generated. By 8:30 a.m., every seat in courtroom 3B was filled, with journalists sketching the scene in notebooks since cameras were prohibited, and even veteran courthouse employees finding excuses to pass by the entrance, hoping to glimpse what many were calling the most heartbreaking testimony in San Diego's judicial history. At precisely 9:30 a.m., Judge Harold Phillips called the court to order, his typically stern demeanor softened slightly as he addressed the packed gallery. "I understand the emotional significance of today's testimony," he stated, scanning the room with a practiced eye. "However, I will not tolerate any disruptions, outbursts, or visible reactions that might influence the jury or distress the witness. Anyone unable to maintain appropriate courtroom decorum will be immediately removed." This admonishment was followed by additional instructions to the jury about evaluating testimony from family members, emphasizing that they should consider Stacey's relationship to both the defendant and the victim when assessing her credibility, while also acknowledging the unique perspective such a witness could provide. Prosecutor Emily Martinez called her key witness with a simple, "The people call Stacey." Setters, her voice betraying none of the emotional weight of the moment. The courtroom fell into complete silence as the side door opened and Stacey entered, escorted by a victim advocate who had been working with her throughout the proceedings. At 19 years old, Stacey's youth was accentuated by her advanced pregnancy, her right hand resting protectively on her belly as she walked slowly to the witness stand. She wore a simple dark blue maternity dress, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, and while her face showed the strain of recent months, her expression was one of determined composure rather than fragility. As she was sworn in, her voice remained steady, though she deliberately avoided looking toward the defense table, where her mother sat, watching her intently. Martinez began her questioning gently, establishing Stacey's background, her educational goals, and the circumstances under which she had met Ray O'Neill during their freshman year at UC San Diego. Stacey's face softened visibly when describing Ray, calling him the kindest person I've ever known, and explaining how their relationship had developed from academic collaboration to deep romantic connection. Ray was serious about everything that mattered, she testified, a small smile briefly crossing her face. His studies, his future in medicine, our relationship. He approached everything with this thoughtful intensity that made you believe in possibilities. This humanizing of Ray seemed to affect several jurors, who nodded in understanding as Stacy painted a picture of a young man whose life had been full of promise and purpose. The testimony shifted to more difficult territory as Martinez guided Stacy through her mother's initial and evolving reactions to her relationship with Ray. At first, she just seemed uncomfortable, making excuses to leave the room when I mentioned him, changing the subject when I talked about our classes together, Stacy explained. But after she met him during Parents' Weekend, it became more direct. She would make comments about how I should focus on school instead of dating, suggesting that relationships at my age weren't worth the distraction. Stacy went on to describe how these seemingly reasonable maternal concerns gradually gave way to more explicitly racial comments, references to cultural differences, and statistical realities about mixed relationships that revealed Tammy's true objections. Martinez methodically established the pattern of escalation in Tammy's opposition, having Stacy recount specific incidents that demonstrated her mother's growing hostility. One particularly revealing episode occurred during spring break when Ray had offered to help paint Tammy's apartment as a goodwill gesture. He spent the whole weekend painting her living room and kitchen, trying so hard to make a good impression, Stacy recalled, her voice tightening with emotion. When he left, she spent an hour wiping down every doorknob and surface he had touched with disinfectant wipes. When I confronted her, she claimed it was because of COVID concerns, but she didn't do the same after her co-workers visited the next day. This anecdote, illustrating the depth of Tammy's physical revulsion toward Ray, visibly impacted the jury, with several members writing extensively in their notebooks. The questioning then moved to the critical period immediately before the murder, with Martinez carefully establishing Stacy's knowledge of the planned meeting between Ray and her mother. Ray was so hopeful about it, Stacy testified, tears forming for the first time. He texted me that afternoon saying he thought this could be a turning point, that he could finally help my mom see him as a person rather than just, she paused, struggling momentarily before continuing, rather than just a black man dating her daughter. Martinez gently asked if Ray had mentioned anything else in his messages that day, leading to the first mention of the pregnancy in Stacy's testimony. He said that once the meeting went well, we could finally tell our families about the baby. We had only confirmed the pregnancy a week earlier and wanted to wait until there was less tension before sharing the news. This revelation about the timing of the pregnancy discovery transitioned naturally to the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, Tammy's confession to her daughter after the murder. Martinez approached this crucial testimony with careful precision, first establishing the chronology of events from Stacy's perspective, learning of Ray's disappearance, the devastating confirmation of his death, and the initial shock and grief that had consumed her. I couldn't process it, Stacy testified, her voice steadying as she recounted those first terrible hours. It felt impossible that someone so full of life could just be gone. My mother was there through all of it, holding me while I cried, telling me she was sorry for my pain, which I believed at the time was genuine sympathy. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Martinez asked the critical question. Stacy, was there a moment when you began to suspect your mother might have been involved in Ray's death? Stacy nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on a middle distance as she recalled the moment her world shifted for a second time. It was the morning after we learned he had been killed. I was so devastated I could barely function, but there was something else I needed to tell her. Stacy's hand moved instinctively to her stomach as she continued. I told her I was pregnant with Ray's child. I thought maybe knowing she would be a grandmother would help her see what I had lost, what we had all lost. Stacy then described how Tammy's entire demeanor had changed with the pregnancy revelation, not with joy or even concern, but with a strange, intense focus that had immediately struck her as wrong. She gripped my shoulders and stared at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Stacy recounted, her voice dropping slightly so that the entire courtroom leaned forward to hear. She said, "No one needs to know who the father was. We can say it was someone else, someone better for you and the baby." It was the way she said was, not is, like she already saw Ray as completely erased from our lives. That's when I first felt this terrible suspicion forming that I couldn't even let myself think about. Martinez then guided Stacy to the pivotal confession, asking directly when and how Tammy had revealed her role in Ray's death. Stacy took a deep breath, visibly steeling herself for the most difficult part of her testimony. It was 3 days after they found him. I was going through my phone, looking at old pictures of us, and I broke down, crying again. My mother came in and tried to take the phone away, saying it wasn't healthy to dwell on the past. We argued, and I shouted something about how she never gave him a chance, how she never even tried to know the real Ray. Stacy paused, her composure momentarily faltering, before she continued with renewed determination. That's when it happened. She just broke. She started crying in this way I'd never seen, not sad crying, but almost panicked, and she grabbed my hand, saying, "I did it for you, Stacy. I couldn't let him ruin your life like your father ruined mine." The impact of this testimony was immediate and profound. A collective intake of breath from the gallery, several jurors visibly recoiling, and even Judge Phillips momentarily closing his eyes as if to process what he had heard. At the defense table, Tammy Setters remained rigidly upright, her expression frozen in a mask of control that seemed increasingly brittle. Martinez allowed a moment for the weight of the confession to settle before asking Stacy to continue, to explain exactly what her mother had said during this crucial admission. She told me she had asked him to meet her at Torrey Pines, saying she wanted to make peace. Stacy continued, her voice now steady despite the tears tracking silently down her cheeks. She said he was so happy about it, so eager to resolve things, that it made what she had to do even harder. She described how she waited for him, how he smiled when he saw her, how he actually thanked her for being willing to talk. Stacy's voice broke slightly on this detail before she composed herself to continue. Then she told me she had brought the gun just in case, but that when he started talking about our future together, about how committed he was to me, she knew what needed to be done. Those were her exact words, not that she decided or chose, but that she knew what needed to be done, like it was inevitable. Martinez gently prompted, "Did your mother describe the actual shooting to you?" Stacy nodded, her expression now composed in a way that suggested she had moved beyond emotion to a place of pure testimony, determined to accurately record what she had been told, regardless of the personal cost. She said it was quick, that he didn't suffer. She said the first shot surprised him, that there was just a moment of confusion on his face before the second shot. She told me she made sure. Stacy swallowed hard before finishing. She made sure he was gone before she left him there. The most devastating aspect of the confession, according to Stacy's testimony, came when Tammy had attempted to justify her actions as maternal protection. She kept saying she had saved me from making her mistakes, that someday I would understand when I saw how hard it was to raise a mixed-race child alone in a judgmental world. Stacy's voice hardened perceptibly as she recounted this rationalization. When I told her that Ray would never have abandoned me like my father did her, she just shook her head like I was being naive. That's when she begged me not to tell anyone, saying over and over, "Please, for the baby's sake, Stacy, what good would it do the baby to know this?" This final appeal, invoking the welfare of the very grandchild whose father Tammy had murdered, became the emotional crescendo of Stacy's testimony. "That's when I realized the full horror of what she had done," Stacy stated, looking directly at the jury for the first time. "She had killed Ray to prevent me from repeating her experience as a single mother, but in doing so, she had guaranteed exactly that outcome. My child will never know his father, not because Ray abandoned us, but because my mother took him from us." This stark articulation of the tragic irony at the heart of the case visibly affected the jury, many of whom were now openly emotional despite Judge Phillips's earlier admonition about maintaining composure. Martinez concluded her direct examination by asking Stacy why she had initially hesitated to share her mother's confession with investigators. "I was terrified and confused," Stacy admitted, her voice small but clear. "Part of me couldn't believe my own mother could do something so horrible. Part of me was worried about what would happen to me and the baby if she went to prison. She's the only family I have. But mostly," she paused, gathering strength for her final statement, "mostly I was struggling with an impossible choice between the mother who raised me and the father of my child who deserved justice. In the end, I realized that Ray would want our child to grow up understanding that truth matters, that justice matters, even when it hurts. I couldn't let my baby grow up with lies about who their father was or why he wasn't there." As Martinez returned to her seat, a heavy silence hung over the courtroom, broken only when Judge Phillips called for a 15-minute recess before cross-examination, an unusual step that acknowledged the emotional intensity of the testimony and provided the jury and witness a needed moment of respite. During this break, observers noted that Tammy Setters remained seated at the defense table, declining even her attorney's suggestion that she step outside, her gaze fixed on some middle distance, as though the reality of her daughter's testimony had created a disconnect too profound to process. Stacy, meanwhile, was escorted to a private room where victim services staff could provide support before she would face questioning from her mother's attorney, a prospect that even seasoned courthouse veterans acknowledged would require extraordinary courage. When proceedings resumed, defense attorney Martin Cooper approached the witness stand with visible caution, his typical assertive cross-examination style noticeably tempered by the delicacy of questioning a pregnant teenager testifying against her own mother. "Ms. Setters, first let me say how sorry I am that you're in this position," he began, his tone genuinely sympathetic. "No one should have to make the choices you've had to make." This opening gesture of compassion, while likely strategic, also seemed authentic, a recognition of the human tragedy unfolding beyond the legal battle. Cooper then began a careful line of questioning designed not to directly challenge Stacy's account of the confession, which would have risked alienating the jury, but to contextualize it within a history of maternal protection rather than racial hatred. "Stacy, would you say your mother was protective of you growing up?" Cooper asked, establishing his theme of maternal concern. Stacy acknowledged this was true, describing how Tammy had worked multiple jobs to provide for her, had been involved in her education, and had made numerous sacrifices to ensure her daughter had opportunities she herself had lacked. Cooper built on this foundation, asking about specific instances when Tammy had demonstrated concern about Stacy's future, monitoring her academic performance, encouraging her college applications, celebrating her scholarship achievements. This line of questioning, while seemingly supportive of Stacy's character, was clearly intended to frame Tammy's later actions as an extreme extension of lifelong maternal protection rather than racial animus. Cooper then shifted to exploring the impact of Tammy's own abandonment by both her parents and husband, asking Stacy whether her mother had shared those painful experiences with her. "She talked about it sometimes," Stacy confirmed, "especially when I was younger and would ask about my grandparents or my father." Cooper gently probed this history, having Stacy confirm that Tammy had been financially devastated by her husband's departure, had struggled with depression afterward, and had frequently expressed fears about Stacy facing similar hardships. Would it be fair to say, Cooper suggested carefully, that your mother's concerns about your relationship with Ray were at least partially rooted in her fear that history would repeat itself, that you might be abandoned as she was? This framing drew an immediate objection from Martinez, who argued it called for speculation about Tammy's motivations. Judge Phillips sustained the objection, instructing Cooper to rephrase. Adjusting his approach, Cooper asked more directly about conversations Tammy and Stacy had regarding Ray's long-term commitment and reliability. Did your mother ever specifically mention concerns about Ray's character, work ethic, or future prospects? He asked, attempting to establish non-racial grounds for Tammy's opposition. Stacy's response effectively dismantled this strategy. No, she never criticized anything specific about Ray as a person. When I would point out his perfect grades, his volunteer work, his job, all the things that showed his character, she would just change the subject or make vague comments about how you can never really know someone. Recognizing the limitations of this approach, Cooper shifted to questioning the reliability of Stacy's recollection of her mother's confession, suggesting that the extreme emotional trauma of Ray's death might have affected her interpretation of Tammy's statements. You were grieving, in shock, and dealing with pregnancy hormones, Cooper noted sympathetically. Is it possible that what you interpreted as a confession was actually your mother expressing guilt for having opposed the relationship, rather than admitting to the murder itself? This question, while carefully phrased, drew another sharp objection from Martinez on grounds of speculation and leading the witness, which Judge Phillips again sustained. Cooper's most effective moment came when he asked Stacy about the timing of her decision to share her mother's confession with investigators, nearly a week after the alleged admission. "Why wait if you were certain about what you had heard?" he asked, his tone curious rather than accusatory. Stacy's answer, however, only strengthened the prosecution's case. "Because I was hoping there was some other explanation," she responded, her voice catching slightly. "I spent days going over every word, every detail, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood or misremembered. I didn't want to believe my mother could do something so terrible, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that she had actually confessed to killing Ray." Recognizing that further questioning risked reinforcing rather than undermining Stacy's testimony, Cooper concluded his cross-examination relatively quickly, a tactical decision that legal observers in the courtroom noted likely reflected the defense's recognition of the damage already done. Martinez declined to conduct a redirect examination, confident that Stacy's testimony had been clear, consistent, and compelling. As Stacy was excused from the witness stand, her final glance toward her mother, a look of profound sadness rather than anger, captured the true tragedy of the case. A family destroyed not just by murder, but by the prejudice that had motivated it. Following Stacy's groundbreaking testimony, the prosecution called forensic psychologist Dr. Eleanor Winfield, whose expertise in family dynamics and intergenerational trauma provided crucial context for understanding Tammy's actions. Dr. Winfield explained how Tammy's experience of being disowned by her parents for an interracial relationship, followed by abandonment by her husband, created a perfect psychological storm where racial resentment became entangled with maternal protection. What we see in this case is not simply racism in its conventional form, Dr. Winfield testified, but a complex psychological process where Ms. Setter's own traumatic experiences were internalized, distorted, and eventually weaponized against a perceived threat to her daughter. This expert testimony helped the jury understand the apparent contradiction in Tammy's history, how someone who had herself been a victim of racial prejudice could perpetuate that same prejudice. Rather than rejecting her parents' racism after experiencing its painful consequences, Dr. Winfield explained, Ms. Setters eventually adopted it as a form of self-protection, convincing herself that her parents had been right all along. This psychological process allowed her to make sense of her husband's abandonment, not as an individual failure, but as an inevitable outcome of crossing racial boundaries, a narrative she then projected onto her daughter's relationship. This analysis provided a framework for understanding Tammy's actions not as random violence, but as the tragic culmination of unresolved trauma and internalized prejudice. The day's final testimony came from Marcus O'Neill, Ray's father, who provided a powerful counterpoint to the defense's narrative by describing his own experience as a black man in an interracial marriage. "My wife and I have been together for 23 years, he testified, his voice steady despite visible emotion. "We've faced prejudice, yes, from strangers, sometimes from extended family, but we faced it together as a team." He described how he and his wife had raised Ray to be proud of his biracial identity and to understand that love requires courage sometimes, especially when others don't understand it. This testimony subtly challenged the defense's implication that Tammy's fears about interracial relationships reflected inevitable reality rather than her personal trauma. Marcus's most impactful testimony came when he described his family's relationship with Stacy since Ray's murder. "She's part of our family now," he stated simply, gesturing toward where Stacy sat in the gallery. "We're going to be there for her and our grandchild, just as we would have if Ray were still here. That baby will know their father through us, through his pictures, his writings, his accomplishments, and our love." This commitment to supporting Stacy and her child offered a powerful contrast to Tammy's fear-based worldview, suggesting an alternative path forward built on acceptance rather than division, a path that Ray had embodied in his life and that would continue through his child despite his death. As the court adjourned for the day, the impact of the testimony was evident on the faces of the jurors, many of whom appeared visibly moved as they filed out of the courtroom. Legal analysts observing the proceedings noted that Stacy's testimony about her mother's confession, combined with the mountain of physical evidence and the expert psychological context, had created an extraordinarily strong case for the prosecution. While the defense would present its witnesses in the coming days, the foundation laid during this pivotal day of testimony had established not just what Tammy Setters had done, but why, creating a comprehensive narrative of how prejudice, trauma, and misguided protection had combined to produce a senseless tragedy that had forever altered the lives of everyone it touched. On February 15, 2021, after 8 days of testimony and evidence presentation, closing arguments in the trial of Tammy Setters began in a courtroom that seemed to vibrate with collective tension. The gallery was filled beyond capacity, with court officers forced to turn away dozens of spectators and media representatives who had lined up before dawn, hoping to witness the final act of what had become San Diego's most closely followed murder trial in recent memory. Judge Harold Phillips, recognizing the heightened emotions surrounding the case, opened the proceedings with a firm reminder to everyone present that the dignity of our judicial process must be maintained regardless of personal feelings about the evidence presented or the verdict that may follow. This admonition set a tone of somber formality that would characterize the day's proceedings, even as the emotional undercurrents ran deep beneath the surface. Prosecutor Emily Martinez rose for her closing argument, approaching the jury with measured steps and a demeanor that balanced professional detachment with appropriate gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear in the hushed courtroom, "over the past 8 days you have heard overwhelming evidence that Tammy Setters methodically planned and executed the murder of Ray O'Neill, a young man whose only crime was loving her daughter across a racial boundary that Ms. Setters could not accept. Martinez then methodically reviewed the mountain of evidence presented. The murder weapon, purchased by Tammy weeks before the crime, the text messages luring Ray to the isolated location, the gunshot residue and blood evidence on her clothing, her cell phone placing her at the scene, and perhaps most damning, her confession to her daughter, in which she explicitly acknowledged killing Ray to protect Stacy from repeating her own experience. Rather than relying solely on emotional appeals, Martinez focused on the logical inconsistencies in Tammy's claimed motive of maternal protection. If Tammy Setters truly wanted to protect her daughter from single motherhood, Martinez argued, her actions make no sense. By killing the father of her grandchild, she guaranteed the very outcome she claimed to fear. Stacy will now raise this child without its father. This stark articulation of the central irony in the case seemed to resonate with the jury, several of whom nodded subtly as Martinez continued, "This isn't protection, it's control. It's prejudice disguised as parental concern. It's a mother deciding that death was preferable to her daughter loving someone she disapproved of." The prosecutor's framing challenged the defense's narrative of misguided maternal love, recasting Tammy's actions as fundamentally about control rather than care. Martinez's most powerful moment came when she addressed the intergenerational aspect of the case, directly confronting the cycle of prejudice that had culminated in Ray's murder. Tammy Setters was once the victim of racial prejudice, she acknowledged, her tone softening momentarily. Rejected by her own parents for an interracial relationship, she experienced firsthand the pain that such discrimination causes. That experience presented her with a choice, to break the cycle or perpetuate it. Martinez paused, scanning the jurors' faces before continuing with renewed intensity. When faced with that choice, Ms. Setters didn't just continue the cycle, she escalated it. Her parents rejected her. She murdered her daughter's boyfriend. Her parents cut her out of their lives. She cut Ray out of existence. This is the tragic progression of prejudice when it remains unexamined and unhealed. This psychological framing was followed by a methodical review of the legal elements of first-degree murder with special circumstances, with Martinez carefully connecting each required component to specific evidence presented at trial. She emphasized the premeditation evident in Tammy's journal entries, gun purchase, and careful selection of an isolated meeting location. The deliberation shown in her text messages, creating a false premise for the meeting, and the lying-in-wait special circumstance demonstrated by her arrival at Torrey Pines before Ray, and positioning herself to approach him when he was vulnerable and unsuspecting. The evidence doesn't just suggest these elements, Martinez stated firmly. It establishes them beyond any reasonable doubt. Martinez concluded by redirecting the jury's attention to the victim and the enduring impact of his loss. Ray O'Neill was 19 years old, a pre-med student with perfect grades, a devoted son, a loving boyfriend, and an expectant father who would never meet his child. Her voice remained steady, but carried unmistakable emotion as she continued, "He represented the very best of what we hope for in our young people, intelligence, compassion, and the courage to love across boundaries. That future, all he would have been, all he would have contributed, all the patients he would have healed as a doctor, was deliberately extinguished by Tammy Setters because she could not overcome her prejudice." With a final nod to the jury, Martinez returned to her seat, leaving in her wake a profound silence that spoke to the impact of her words. Defense attorney Martin Cooper faced the challenging task of following this compelling summation, rising from the defense table with the deliberate movements of someone carrying a heavy burden. His approach acknowledged the substantial evidence against his client while attempting to reframe the narrative around diminished capacity rather than outright denial. There is no question that this case represents a profound tragedy, Cooper began, his tone somber and reflective. A young man with immense promise lost his life. A young woman lost her boyfriend and the father of her child. A family lost their beloved son. And yes, Tammy Setters lost her way in a moment that cannot be undone. This frank acknowledgement of his client's actions represented a strategic shift from challenging the facts to seeking mitigation through context and psychology. Cooper focused heavily on Tammy's personal history, reminding the jury of her own experience of racial rejection by her parents, followed by abandonment by her husband, traumas that had shaped her worldview in profound and ultimately destructive ways. Tammy Setters' mind became a battlefield where past pain distorted present reality, Cooper argued. The prosecution has portrayed her as coldly calculating, but the evidence shows a woman consumed by irrational fear that her daughter would experience the same rejection and abandonment that had defined her own life. This psychological framing aimed to position Tammy's actions as the product of mental and emotional disturbance rather than deliberate malice, potentially opening the door to a lesser charge than first-degree murder. The defense's most compelling argument came when Cooper addressed the journal entries that had been presented as evidence of premeditation. These writings don't show a woman plotting murder, he suggested, but a mother spiraling into obsessive fear, losing touch with reality as she convinced herself that extreme action was necessary to protect her child. Cooper emphasized entries where Tammy had written about saving Stacy rather than expressing explicit racial hatred, attempting to reframe her motivation as distorted maternal protection rather than prejudice. This nuanced approach acknowledged the reality of Tammy's actions while seeking to contextualize them within a psychological framework that might evoke some measure of understanding, if not forgiveness. Cooper concluded with a direct appeal to the jury's sense of justice rather than mercy. "Your verdict cannot restore what has been lost," he stated solemnly. "It cannot bring Ray back to his family or to Stacy and their child. It cannot undo the damage that has been done, but it can reflect the complex truth of this case that Tammy Setters' actions, while inexcusable, arose from a mind distorted by trauma and fear rather than cold-blooded calculation." He asked the jury to consider the lesser-included charge of second-degree murder, which would acknowledge Tammy's responsibility while recognizing the psychological factors that had influenced her actions. "Justice demands accountability," Cooper concluded, "but it also demands truth in all its complex, uncomfortable reality." Following closing arguments, Judge Phillips provided detailed instructions to the jury regarding the legal definitions of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and the special circumstance of lying in wait. He emphasized that their decision must be based solely on the evidence presented in court and the law as he had explained it, setting aside personal emotions or opinions about racial issues that might influence their deliberations. After these instructions, which took nearly an hour to deliver, the jury was sequestered to begin their deliberations at 2:17 p.m. on February 15th, with few in the courtroom expecting a quick resolution to such a complex and emotionally charged case. To the surprise of legal observers and the families waiting anxiously for news, the jury sent word to Judge Phillips at 6:23 p.m., just over 4 hours after beginning deliberations, that they had reached a unanimous verdict. As word spread through the courthouse and to the media encampment outside, there was a palpable sense of disbelief at the speed with which the 12 jurors had arrived at their decision. Spectators who had left the courthouse expecting days rather than hours of deliberation rushed back to claim seats in the gallery, while court officers implemented enhanced security measures in anticipation of a potentially emotional response to the verdict, whatever it might be. At 7:00 p.m., Judge Phillips reconvened court, the late hour underscoring the extraordinary circumstances of a verdict reached so quickly in a murder trial. As the jurors filed in, Their faces were solemn but composed, avoiding eye contact with both the gallery and the defendant. The courtroom fell into complete silence as Judge Phillips addressed the jury foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a 52-year-old high school teacher, rose and responded simply, "We have, Your Honor." The written verdict was passed to the court clerk, who handed it to Judge Phillips for review. After examining the document, his expression revealing nothing, the judge returned it to the clerk with instructions to read the verdict aloud. In the matter of the people of the state of California versus Tammy Setters, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, not at the verdict itself, which many had anticipated given the strength of the evidence, but at the speed and unanimity with which it had been reached. The clerk continued, "On the special circumstance allegation that the murder was committed by lying in wait, we, the jury, find this allegation to be true." This additional finding ensured that Tammy would face life in prison without the possibility of parole, effectively guaranteeing she would never be free again. As the verdict was read, Tammy Setters stood between her attorneys, her posture rigid and her face expressionless, displaying the same contained composure she had maintained throughout the trial. Only a slight tremor in her clasped hands betrayed any emotional reaction to the pronouncement that would consign her to spend the remainder of her life in prison. Behind her in the gallery, reactions were more visible. Marcus and Denise O'Neill embraced silently, tears streaming down their faces as they received the justice they had sought for their son, while beside them Stacy Setters closed her eyes briefly, her expression reflecting not triumph, but a complex mixture of relief, grief, and finality. Judge Phillips thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for March 5th, though the guilty verdict on first-degree murder with special circumstances left little discretion in the sentence that would be imposed. As court officers prepared to escort Tammy back to county jail, she turned for the first time to look directly at her daughter in the gallery, a gaze that Stacy met unflinchingly across the crowded courtroom. No words were exchanged in that moment, but observers close enough to see described it as a silent acknowledgment between them of all that had been lost and could never be recovered, a family severed not just by the criminal justice system, but by the choices that had led them to this moment. Outside the courthouse, as news of the verdict spread through the assembled crowd, reactions reflected the diverse perspectives the case had evoked throughout the community. Supporters of the O'Neill family, many wearing blue ribbons in Ray's memory, expressed satisfaction that justice had been served, while activists from several civil rights organizations pointed to the case as evidence of the persistent reality of racial prejudice and its deadly consequences. Media crews conducted interviews with legal experts who expressed little surprise at the verdict, given the overwhelming evidence, though many noted the unusual speed of the jury's decision as an indication of the clarity with which they viewed Tammy's guilt. In a brief press conference on the courthouse steps, District Attorney Maria Vasquez commended the prosecution team while emphasizing the broader significance of the case. Today's verdict affirms that in San Diego County, prejudice is not an acceptable motive for violence, Vasquez stated firmly. This case reminds us that racial hatred can hide behind many facades, including, most tragically, the guise of parental concern. Justice for Ray O'Neill cannot restore his life or the future that was taken from him, but it does affirm that our justice system will hold accountable those who commit violence motivated by prejudice, regardless of how they attempt to justify it. The most moving statement came from Marcus O'Neill, who spoke briefly to reporters with his wife Denise and Stacy Setters beside him, a visual representation of the unlikely family unit that had formed in the wake of tragedy. "My son believed in the power of love to overcome prejudice," Marcus stated, his voice steady despite his evident emotion. "He was killed for that belief, But today's verdict shows that the truth he lived by is stronger than the hatred that took his life. Ray is gone, but what he stood for and the child he left behind will continue. This reference to Stacy's pregnancy, now in its final weeks, prompted several reporters to direct questions to her, which Marcus firmly but politely deflected, stating that the family was focused on healing and preparing for the birth that would represent both loss and continuation. Defense attorney Martin Cooper offered a brief statement acknowledging the jury's decision while indicating that potential appeal options would be evaluated in the coming weeks. This case presents complex questions about the intersection of personal trauma, mental health, and criminal responsibility, Cooper noted. While we respect the jury's verdict, we believe there are substantive issues regarding pretrial publicity and evidentiary rulings that warrant review. Legal analysts observing the case, however, expressed skepticism about the prospects for a successful appeal given the strength of the evidence and the careful management of the trial by Judge Phillips, whose reputation for running procedurally flawless proceedings made reversal unlikely. As night fell on San Diego and the crowds gradually dispersed from the courthouse, the city began processing the conclusion of a case that had forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about the persistence of racial prejudice, even in a community that prided itself on diversity and tolerance. Local religious leaders called for reflection and healing, while university students at UCSD organized a candlelight vigil in Ray's memory, emphasizing his academic achievements and community service rather than simply his status as a victim. These diverse responses reflected the many layers of impact the case had generated, from the personal tragedy of lives destroyed to broader questions about how prejudice persists and transforms across generations. For Stacy Setters, the verdict marked not an ending, but a transition to a new and uncharted phase of life, preparing to raise her child without either the father she had loved or the mother who had raised her. As she left the courthouse surrounded by the O'Neill family who had embraced her as their own, her hand resting protectively on her belly where Ray's child grew, she embodied both the deepest tragedy of the case and its only hope for healing. The possibility that the cycle of prejudice that had claimed Ray's life might finally be broken in the next generation. The jury's swift and unambiguous verdict had provided legal closure, but for those most directly affected, the emotional and psychological aftermath was only beginning. A journey of grief, memory, and ultimately, perhaps, redemption through the new life that would carry forward Ray O'Neill's legacy, despite his mother-in-law's deadly attempt to erase it. On March 5, 2021, the San Diego County Superior Courthouse hosted the final formal act in the legal saga of Tammy Setters, the sentencing hearing that would officially determine her fate for murdering her daughter's boyfriend, Ray O'Neill. Unlike the tension-filled days of the trial, the sentencing proceedings carried an air of somber inevitability, the guilty verdict having already established that Tammy would spend the remainder of her life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nevertheless, the courtroom was filled to capacity once more, as those connected to the case gathered to witness this final moment of judicial accountability, and for many to deliver impact statements that would become part of the official record. Testimonies to how one woman's deadly prejudice had created ripples of devastation extending far beyond her intended target. Judge Harold Phillips entered the courtroom at precisely 10:00 a.m., his demeanor reflecting the gravity of the occasion rather than triumph at justice served. After addressing preliminary matters and confirming that all parties were prepared to proceed, he turned to the prosecution. The court will now hear victim impact statements. This invitation opened the most emotionally charged portion of the proceedings, beginning with Marcus O'Neill, who approached the podium with dignified composure, a written statement in his hands that trembled slightly despite his evident determination to maintain control. As Ray's father looked directly at Tammy Setters for the first time since the trial began, the courtroom fell into absolute silence, every person present recognizing the profound weight of this confrontation between a grieving father and the woman who had robbed him of his only son. "Ms. Setters," Marcus began, his deep voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "I stand here today not only as the father of the young man you murdered, but as someone who understands exactly what you claim to fear." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "Like you, I have experienced what it means to love across racial lines in a world that sometimes rejects such love. Like you, I know the hurtful words, the disapproving glances, the doors that suddenly close. But unlike you, I chose to face that prejudice with courage rather than surrender to it, and eventually to triumph over it through a 23-year marriage that produced an extraordinary son who embodied the best of both his heritages. This direct parallel between their experiences created a powerful rebuke to Tammy's claimed motive, highlighting the choice she had made to perpetuate rather than overcome the cycle of prejudice. Marcus continued by speaking directly about what had been lost, not in abstract terms of potential or future, but in the specific, tangible reality of who Ray had been. "My son kept a journal of medical cases he found interesting, with notes about how he might have approached treatment. At 19 years old, already thinking like the doctor he would never become. He volunteered every Saturday at a youth science program in our old neighborhood, showing kids who looked like him that they belonged in laboratories and medical schools. He called his mother every day, no matter how busy he was with classes or work, because he understood that love requires action, not just feeling. These intimate details of Ray's life, shared with quiet dignity rather than performative grief, humanized him in a way that transcended his status as a victim, forcing everyone present, including Tammy, to confront the full humanity of the life she had extinguished. The most powerful moment in Marcus's statement came when he addressed the future that now lay before them all, a future irrevocably altered, but not without hope. "In 3 weeks, my wife and I will welcome our first grandchild into this world, Ray's child, who will never know their father except through our memories and stories. This is the final cruelty of what you did, Ms. Setters. You not only took Ray's life, but attempted to sever his legacy." Marcus's voice remained steady as he delivered his conclusion. "But you failed in that goal. Ray lives on, not just in his child, but in the scholarship fund established in his name that will send 5 students to college this fall, in the community center science lab now dedicated to his memory, and in the hundreds of lives he touched in his brief 19 years. Your hatred was powerful enough to end his life, but not powerful enough to erase the love and light he brought to this world." As Marcus returned to his seat where Denise reached for his hand in silent support, Stacy Setters approached the podium next. Now, in the final days of her pregnancy, her physical condition a visible reminder of the new life that would emerge from this tragedy. Unlike her testimony during the trial, which had focused on factual details of her mother's confession, Stacy's impact statement addressed the profound personal betrayal she had experienced. "Mom," she began simply, using the informal address for the first time in the formal proceedings, "I have tried for months to understand how the woman who taught me to tie my shoes, who held me when I was sick, who encouraged me to pursue my dreams, could be the same person who murdered the father of her grandchild." Stacy's statement navigated the complex terrain of loving someone who has committed an unforgivable act, a daughter's perspective rarely heard in criminal proceedings. "I remember you telling me stories about your own parents disowning you, about how much that rejection hurt you. You would cry sometimes, talking about how families should stand by each other no matter what. Those stories shaped me. They made me value acceptance and fairness." Her voice cracked slightly as she continued, So the hardest part of all this isn't just losing Ray or knowing you took him from me. It's realizing that you became what hurt you most, someone who would reject love because it didn't fit your idea of what was acceptable. The most powerful aspect of Stacy's statement emerged when she addressed the future of her child, a future that would now include navigating the complex truth of how their father died. In a few weeks, I will give birth to Ray's son. Someday he will ask questions about his father, and eventually about his grandmother. I've thought endlessly about what I will tell him. Stacy paused, her hand resting protectively on her belly as she continued with renewed resolve. I've decided that I will tell him the truth, all of it, the beautiful truth about his father's kindness, intelligence, and courage, and the terrible truth about how prejudice can poison even a mother's love for her child. I will teach him that he comes from both tremendous love and devastating hatred, and that every day he will have the choice of which legacy to carry forward. This framing of her child's future as a choice between competing legacies, Ray's inclusive love versus Tammy's destructive prejudice, represented the most profound indictment of Tammy's actions, coming not from the legal system, but from the daughter she had claimed to be protecting. Stacy concluded with a statement that balanced accountability with a daughter's complex love. Mom, what you did was unforgivable, and you deserve the consequences you now face, but I want you to know that I'm not going to teach your grandson to hate you. Instead, I'll teach him about the grandmother you could have been, should have been, if you had chosen to break the cycle of prejudice rather than escalate it. That's the only way I know to honor both the father he lost and the mother I've lost, though in very different ways. Following Stacy's statement, several of Ray's classmates, professors, and community members, where he had volunteered, spoke briefly about specific ways in which his loss had affected them. The student study group that kept an empty chair in his memory, the pediatric patients at the free clinic who still asked about the tall doctor student who had made them laugh during procedures, the high school science teacher who had mentored Ray and now used his story to teach students about overcoming barriers. These testimonies created a mosaic of impact that extended far beyond the immediate circle of family, demonstrating how a single act of hatred had created concentric circles of loss throughout the San Diego community. When all victim impact statements had been delivered, Judge Phillips turned to Tammy Setters, offering her the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, a standard procedure, though many defendants in her position declined to speak. To the surprise of many present, Tammy rose slowly from her seat, her attorney looking somewhat concerned as she approached the podium. Throughout the trial and the impact statements, she had maintained an almost unnatural composure, her face revealing little of her internal state. Now, for the first time, that mask appeared to slip slightly as she faced those she had harmed, her hands gripping the edges of the podium with visible tension. I know that nothing I say can change what I've done or ease the pain I've caused, Tammy began, her voice softer than it had been during her brief testimony during the trial. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. She paused, seeming to struggle with what would come next, before continuing with a directness that had been absent from her previous court appearances. I believed I was protecting my daughter from the pain I had experienced, the rejection, the abandonment, the struggle. But I see now that I wasn't protecting Stacy. I was trying to control her, to force her life into a shape that would validate my own choices and fears. This acknowledgement of her true motivation, control rather than protection, represented the first genuine moment of accountability in Tammy's public statements. Tammy then addressed her daughter directly, turning slightly toward where Stacy sat with the O'Neill family. Stacy, you deserved a mother who could see Ray for who he truly was, not for what my fears projected onto him. You deserved a mother who could grow beyond her own pain instead of using it to justify causing more pain. Her voice broke slightly as she continued, I will spend the rest of my life knowing that I robbed you and your child of someone who loved you both, someone who, by all accounts, would have been a better parent than I managed to be. This rare moment of genuine emotion from Tammy created a palpable shift in the courtroom atmosphere, though whether it represented true remorse or simply regret at facing consequences remained unclear to many observers. In her final comments, Tammy acknowledged the O'Neill family with a directness that seemed to surprise even her own attorney. To raise parents, there are no words adequate for the harm I've done to your family. You raised an exceptional young man who saw beyond the boundaries I couldn't overcome. The fact that you've embraced my daughter and grandchild, despite what I did, speaks to the character that Ray inherited from you. That decency makes what I did even more unforgivable. With that final acknowledgment, Tammy returned to her seat, her brief statement having neither asked for leniency nor offered excuses, an unusual approach that suggested either a genuine recognition of the magnitude of her crime or a strategic decision to appear contrite before sentencing. Judge Harold Phillips, who had presided over the case with consistent fairness and gravitas, now prepared to deliver the sentence that would conclude the formal legal proceedings. With over 3 decades of experience on the bench, Phillips was known for sentencing statements that went beyond procedural requirements to address the broader implications of the crimes before him, a practice that had earned him respect from both prosecution and defense attorneys for bringing moral clarity to the often clinical language of the law. After reviewing the jury's findings and confirming the applicable sentencing guidelines, Phillips looked directly at Tammy Setters as he delivered his final judgment in the case. Tammy Setters, having been found guilty by a jury of your peers of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of lying in wait, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, as mandated by California law. This formal pronouncement, while expected, still sent a ripple through the courtroom as the finality of Tammy's fate was officially established. However, Judge Phillips did not conclude there, choosing instead to address the deeper implications of the case in a statement that would be quoted extensively in subsequent media coverage and legal analysis. Beyond the legal sentence, I feel compelled to address the profound tragedy that this case represents, not just for the victim and his family, but for our community and indeed our society, Phillips continued, his tone shifting from legal pronouncement to ethical reflection. This court has seen many murders over the years, each representing a failure of our most basic social compact. But this case stands out for its particular perversion of what should be our most protective relationship, that between parent and child. Phillips paused, seeming to choose his next words with particular care. Ms. Setters, you experienced racial prejudice firsthand when your parents rejected you for an interracial relationship. That experience presented you with a profound choice, to perpetuate that prejudice or to overcome it. The evidence in this case shows that you not only chose to perpetuate it, but to escalate it from rejection to murder. Judge Phillips then addressed the cycle of prejudice that had defined the case, a theme that had emerged repeatedly throughout the trial. This case demonstrates how prejudice can transform across generations, adapting like a virus to new hosts and conditions. Your parents expressed their prejudice through rejection. You expressed yours through violence. You disguised this prejudice as maternal protection, perhaps even to yourself. But the evidence clearly showed it was fundamentally about control, your inability to accept your daughter's autonomy to love across the boundaries that had defined your own pain. This psychological framing, delivered with the authority of the court, offered a powerful articulation of how prejudice operates not just through explicit hatred, but through control disguised as care, a dynamic that resonated beyond this specific case to broader patterns in society. In his concluding remarks, Judge Phillips addressed the legacy of the case and its implications for the community. While this court's authority extends only to determining legal consequences for criminal actions, I would be remiss not to acknowledge the broader healing that must now begin. Raymond O'Neill's life was cut tragically short, but his legacy continues, not just in the child who will soon be born, but in the example he set of courage in the face of prejudice. Phillips then made direct reference to Stacy's pregnancy, noting that the child who will enter this world in the coming weeks represents both the tragedy of what was lost and the hope of what may yet be redeemed, a new generation with the opportunity to break cycles that have caused immeasurable harm. With those final reflections, Judge Phillips formally concluded the proceedings, and court officers prepared to escort Tammy Setters from the courtroom to begin her life sentence at the California Institution for Women in Corona. As she was led away, Tammy turned one final time toward her daughter, a glance that Stacy met with a complex expression that seemed to hold grief, resolution, and perhaps a hint of compassion, though not forgiveness. This silent exchange, witnessed by everyone present, encapsulated the human tragedy at the heart of the legal case, a mother and daughter permanently severed not just by the justice system, but by choices that could never be undone. Outside the courthouse, as reporters gathered reaction statements from those connected to the case, the emphasis shifted from the details of the crime to the broader implications for the community and for race relations in San Diego and beyond. Civil rights leaders pointed to the case as evidence of how prejudice remains a lethal force even in supposedly progressive communities, while mental health advocates highlighted the need for better understanding of how trauma can perpetuate cycles of harm across generations. For many San Diegans, the case had forced uncomfortable reflections on the persistence of racial divisions beneath the city's laid-back multicultural image, a reckoning that community leaders pledged would lead to substantive dialogue rather than defensive denial. On March 24, 2021, less than 3 weeks after the sentencing hearing, Raymond Marcus O'Neill Setters was born at Scripps Memorial Hospital, 7 pounds 4 ounces of new life emerging from tragedy. The birth announcement, published in the San Diego Union-Tribune, alongside a small photo of the newborn being held by Stacy and surrounded by Ray's parents, marked a symbolic transition from the story of Ray's death to the ongoing story of his legacy. Stacy's decision to give her son both her last name and the O'Neill name represented her commitment to honoring both sides of his heritage, ensuring that his paternal identity would be acknowledged and celebrated despite his father's absence. In the months that followed, as San Diego's media attention gradually shifted to other stories, the quiet work of building a future in the aftermath of tragedy continued for those most directly affected. Marcus and Denise O'Neill, now in the unexpected role of helping to raise their grandchild alongside their son's girlfriend rather than their son, converted their home office into a nursery painted in the blue and white colors of UC San Diego, a tribute to where Ray and Stacy had met and fallen in love. Stacy, balancing new motherhood with continued education, transferred from UCSD to San Diego State University to be closer to the O'Neill's home, adjusting her academic plans but maintaining her commitment to the scientific career she and Ray had discussed so often. The Ray O'Neill Memorial Scholarship Fund, initially established by the Youth Center, where Ray had volunteered, grew substantially through community donations and a matching grant from UC San Diego's Alumni Association. By the fall semester of 2021, the fund had supported 5 students from underrepresented backgrounds pursuing education in medical fields, living testimonies to the potential that had been lost with Ray's death, but that could be nurtured in others. The scholarship recipients, selected in part for their commitment to serving diverse communities, represented the positive legacy that had emerged from tragedy, young people who would carry forward not just Ray's name, but his vision of healing across boundaries. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the case emerged in the ongoing relationship between Stacy Setters and the O'Neill family, a connection that defied conventional categories, united not just by shared grief but by shared purpose in raising Ray's son. Their unconventional family unit became, for many in the community, a powerful symbol of how love could transcend the very boundaries that Tammy's prejudice had found insurmountable. While rarely seeking public attention, they occasionally participated in community discussions about racial healing and restorative justice, offering their lived experience as both warning and inspiration, a family formed through tragedy but sustained through conscious choice to break cycles of division. For Tammy Setters, the consequences of her actions extended far beyond the prison walls that would contain her for the remainder of her life. Prison records would later reveal that she initially refused all visitors, including the few former colleagues who attempted to maintain contact. Her first year of incarceration was marked by isolation, both imposed and chosen, as she adjusted to the reality of a life sentence. It was only in late 2022, according to journalists who followed the case's aftermath, that Tammy began participating in a prison program focused on restorative justice, where inmates explored the ripple effects of their crimes and confronted the harm they had caused. Whether this represented genuine evolution or simply an attempt to make her confinement more bearable remained a question that only Tammy herself could answer, and one she declined to address in the few carefully worded written statements she released through her attorney. The most enduring questions raised by the case about how prejudice transforms across generations, how trauma can distort love into control, and how communities respond to hatred in their midst, remained subjects of ongoing conversation in San Diego long after the formal legal proceedings concluded. Local schools incorporated the case into curriculum units on prejudice and its consequences, using age-appropriate materials to help students understand how biases form and how they can be challenged. Religious leaders across faiths referenced the case in sermons about forgiveness, accountability, and breaking cycles of harm. Community organizations developed programming specifically addressing how parents could recognize and interrupt the transmission of their own traumas and prejudices to their children. 5 years after Ray O'Neill's murder, on August 4, 2025, a small gathering took place at Torrey Pines State Natural Reserve, not at the site of the murder, which had been deliberately avoided by those who loved Ray, but at a scenic overlook where he had once taken Stacy on a hiking date early in their relationship. Marcus and Denise O'Neill, now in their early 60s but still active in community work focused on racial healing, stood beside Stacy Setters, who had recently completed her master's degree in biochemistry. Between them stood 5-year-old Raymond, a kindergartner with his father's smile and thoughtful demeanor, old enough now to understand that they were remembering someone special, but not yet old enough to comprehend the full circumstances of his father's absence. As the sun began to set over the Pacific Ocean, casting golden light across the dramatic coastal landscape, Raymond released a blue balloon into the sky. A simple ritual developed to help him connect with the father he would know only through stories, photographs, and the love of those who had known him. Watching the balloon drift upward until it became a tiny speck against the vast sky, Stacy knelt beside her son and gently explained, as she did each year, "That's to remind your daddy how much we love him, and to remind us that love is stronger than anything that tries to stop it." In that quiet moment, witnessed only by those closest to Ray, the legacy of his life and of the prejudice that had ended it continued to unfold in the most meaningful way possible. Through a child being taught that boundaries are meant to be crossed, not reinforced, that love requires courage, and that even the deepest wounds can become sources of healing if we choose a different path than those who have harmed us. This living legacy, a child raised with conscious awareness of both the love and the hatred that had shaped his existence, represented the most profound response to Tammy Setter's attempt to erase Ray O'Neal from her daughter's life. In seeking to prevent an interracial relationship from producing a child, she had instead guaranteed that such a child would be raised with explicit awareness of racial identity, prejudice, and the courage required to overcome it. In this profound irony lay both the tragedy of what had been lost and the hope of what might yet be redeemed, a hope embodied in a young boy running along a coastal path in San Diego, carrying in his very existence the proof that cycles of prejudice, no matter how deeply entrenched, can ultimately be broken by those brave enough to choose a different way forward.